Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. Mother. The sound of the Lord Commander's voice jolted Sir Davos out of his fitful doze. Sat bolt upright, he found Dolorous Ed standing at Jon Snow's side and looking equally startled. Neither of them dared speak and leaned in closer to the other man's unconscious body. Breath held as they waited for further signs of life. Not in all these months had Davos heard Jon form a word so complete, so unambiguous. Even if the feat went unrepeated, he couldn't help but look upon it as a positive sign. The most optimistic they had had since the fatal stabbing had occurred. After several long minutes, both men released their held breaths and slowly sank back into the previous stances. Then it came again. Mother! He never knew his mother, said Ed. Not even her name. Maybe he's dreaming of her, Davos speculated. Not knowing her was no reason not to conjure her in his sleep, for even the blind believed in color. Excuse me, but I need to get some air. Send for me immediately, if anything changes. Ed nodded his assent, and Davos pushed back the chair he'd been sat in for almost a day and a night. Even his meals were brought to him in the Lord Commander's chambers, along with some blankets to keep him warm during the long hours of darkness. After so long shut away with a man half dead, breathing the open air again felt like being reborn. Despite the chaotic scenes that followed the attack on Jon and his subsequent coma, life at Castle Black had settled into a natural rhythm of near normality. Ranging still happened, reports of others and White Walkers still filtered back, and news from the realm at large still found its way to their gates. Not so long ago, Ramsay Bolton had written to demand the return of his bride, and he could only be grateful that Lady Sansa was safely out of the way when Ed read out that letter. For Davos' part, it was only his own sense of honor that stopped him from sending back the messenger's head. Honor, and a healthy fear of being attacked by Bolton forces while Jon slept on. Once out of the Lord Commander's chambers, he looked up at the vast and glittering edifice of the wall. Sometimes he could hear the ice cracking and could see it sweat under the distant sun. Sometimes, despite its size and age, it felt a flimsy protection from what he had heard dwelled beyond it. Ice monsters and armies of corpses raised from the dead. All the scary stories the nursemaids told their charges to give them a thrill before bedtime. He never once imagined it could ever be real. As he always did when passing the wall, he stopped to look up at it again. Shielding his eyes from the sun, he sometimes couldn't see the top of it as it vanished into the mists above. Just as it did on that morning. He thought to resume his search for Jon's sword, Longclaw, until a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. Sir Davos, more news from the south. Davos turned and greeted the young steward. Not Winterfell, I hope. No news is good news on that front. No, Sirdar, the man assured him. It's King's Landing. Cersei Lannister has been proclaimed Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. Her son, King Tommen, dead by his own hand. The Tyrells all herded into the Sept of Baelor and blown up with wildfire. For a long moment, Davos was speechless. Cersei has no claim, he began, then remembered just how many people had fought over that absurd iron chair. Every time it changed hands, its significance was chipped away, and Davos no longer cared. Oh, what does it matter anyway? The war is in the north, and Jon Snow was right all along. It won't matter who sits the Iron Throne once winter comes. What else have you got for me? Something altogether more pleasant. Sir Lady Sansa and the Lady Melisandre are making their way back to Castle Black, he replied, raising a smile. All their company is joining them, and they should be here by morning. A raven arrived with the message not a half hour ago. Davos breathed a sigh of relief. Excellent. Have chambers prepared for them, if you will. They'll be exhausted by the time they get here. All news imparted, the two men went their separate ways. However, Davos changed course and headed for the tunnel that led through the base of the wall. They'd been gone so long, and he had had no word of their progress, that he'd half a mind to ride out into the wilderness himself and meet them. He paused at the iron-barred gate and looked out over the featureless landscape and decided against it. The vast host was moving north, hoping to cut the rebels off before reaching the Trident. Despite their numbers, they moved fast, seemingly fueled by their own sense of urgency. Jon hadn't given it much thought, but their journey took them past Harrenhal, the place where it all seemed to begin. If anyone shared his sudden nostalgia, no one stopped to indulge it with him. As such, he urged his new destrier onwards, and farther north. The Trident was less than a day's march away, and already their outriders had already brought back word of rebel forces in the area. They had given Stony Septa a wide berth since learning of the Royalists' defeat there, something that had cast Prince Rhaegar in a dark mood. Then Jon realized the prince had been in a dark mood ever since they left King's Landing. He paced, with his arms crossed defensively across his middle, scowl fixed permanently in place, and uncommunicative towards even those among them. He counted as close friends. Sometimes he seemed to notice Jon looking, which caused him to swiftly drop his gaze and pretend to be busy doing something else. All the while, Jon wrenched himself in half over whether or not to say anything to the prince. He agonized over it while sat alone in front of his own campfire, waiting for a capon to cook. So lost in his own thoughts, he hadn't noticed the fatty skin blistering in the heat and turning to black charcoal. He swiftly knocked the spit off its stand, burning his fingers in the process, and swearing audibly. He was about to skulk away and barter for a rabbit carcass when a disembodied hand held a bowl of broth in front of him. "Looks like you burned your supper. Here, have this." Relieved and touched by the generosity, Jon looked up to thank the man, not realizing it was the prince. "Thank you, your grace. I appreciate it." Rosier dismissed his thanks with a wave of his hand, settling himself down beside Jon at the fire. "You've been giving me the strangest of looks over these last few weeks." "I don't think so." "No, really," insisted the prince. "Is there anything you want to say to me?" There was much and more he needed to say, but very little he actually felt inclined to say. He had a father already. Ned Stark had been his father, and always would be. But most of the men around them would be dead within a day, and compared to that little seemed to matter anymore. "Have you ever fought in a battle before, your grace?" he asked, then made a start on his supper. Meanwhile, Roger looked into the cook fire. "I've fought in tourneys." "So, you haven't fought in a battle before?" Jon cut in impertinently. "Forgive me, I didn't mean to interrupt." "No, you're right," Roger assured him. He wet his dry lips, and Jon noted they were cracked from where he had been biting them. "You're all too right, Jon. I've played at battle, but never been in a real one. I suppose all that will change by tomorrow, for better or worse." There was a raft of advice he could give the prince, but none of it seemed to formulate in his mind. Besides, Rhaegar was being advised by the likes of Sir Barristan Selmy. There was little Jon could add to the experiences of a man of Selmy's stature. It would all be about posture, poise, and battlefield tactics. It was then that Jon remembered what it all really boiled down to. "Stick him with the pointy end," he advised, smiling wanly. Rosier's brow creased as their eyes met, gray on indigo. He seemed confused, before slowly giving in to the laughter. "Sage advice. Oh, wise one." The two men fell silent, each looking into the flames as darkness fell all around them. It was a companionable silence, during which Jon finished his supper and absent-mindedly poked at the burning logs with the stick he'd used as a spit. It sent up a shower of bright orange sparks, glowing against the indigo sky. Jon watched them soar upwards before the cooling air snuffed them out. "Don't be afraid, your grace," he said, at length. He wasn't going to lie to the man and assure him all would be well. It wouldn't. He was going to die, and nothing either of them could do would stop it. "Once the battle starts, you lose all your fear." "I'm not scared about the battle," Rosier cut over him, irritably. Realizing he was being ill-tempered, he drew a deep breath to compose himself. "Before we left King's Landing, Jaime Lannister told me something, that my father has been raping my mother. If that wasn't bad enough, she's now pregnant again. At a time like this, he's raped a baby into her." Afraid of saying the wrong thing, Jon held his silence while making it clear he was listening. "And father has wildfire rigged up all over the city." Rosier continued, "Even if I win this battle, how do I get rid of my father without having him blast us all to pieces with the wildfire? He would murder every man, woman, and child in the city just to stop me from dethroning him. And dare I say it, Robert Baratheon will find himself with much the same problem if he proves victorious." There was one particular detail that Jon was curious about. "Does Jaime Lannister know about the wildfire?" "Yes," Roger confirmed. "Everyone at court knows. They're just too terrified to speak up against Daenerys." The prince paused, then patted Jon firmly on the back. "Thank you for humoring me in my peculiar mood, Jon. But I really must go to bed, and I think you'd benefit from doing the same. I bid you good night." "Good night, your grace," replied Jon, who had no intention of turning in. No sooner did Rhaegar leave than someone else sat down in his vacant spot. Startled, Jon was about to politely shoulder the newcomer until he realized it was the three-eyed raven. In his hands was an earthenware bowl with a thick, red, and pasty substance in it. "You may want to give your father this for his breakfast," the old man said, handing him the bowl. Jon took it and sniffed at it. It smelled woody. "What is it?" "Something that will make tomorrow a little easier on him," he replied. "Tell him it's something that helped keep his strength up for the battle." He remembered Sansa and Bran mentioning the paste before. It helped ease them through the time barriers or something like that. "The raven must live on the putrid-looking stuff." "I never had it," he said, giving the mixture another sniff. "Anyway, I thought to take the prince's place. You know, I get done up in his armor and he runs off to hide." "The ink is dry, Rhaegar is dead," the raven cut in. "Besides all that, just imagine you walk up to Prince Rhaegar now and tell him to run from the battle. How do you imagine he would react?" Jon's heart sank a little. "I can quite imagine, but won't this stuff knock him out? Or I could put something in it." "The ink is dry, Jon," the raven cut in. "Which means Rhaegar is dead. Even your sister saw him dead on the banks of that river. Just stay close to him. Once the battle is done. Now you really should get some sleep." "But sleep," the old man cut in again. "You'll need a clear head in the morning." The old man was gone before Jon could reply. Like Bran, he seemed to just vaporize at will. After sheathing Longclaw, he returned to his tent. It pitched close to the prince's, inside which he could still see the prince poring over maps and plans with the other commanders. He still had a faint urge to just tell them they were wasting their time, even though she had had no weapons training at all. Sansa still felt like a different person with a sword belt on. Pod had buckled it over her kirtle, the sword itself sheathed in its scabbard embossed with the sigil of House Stark. As she and her company rode south to the wall, she reached for its pommel and wrapped her hand around it for reassurance. Even if her Garen hit a bump in the road and the sword bashed against her leg, she didn't mind. At nights, she drew the blade and tilted it to catch the light of their campfire. For such an old thing, it was still perfectly usable, and her Bran undoubtedly had sharpened it since it was liberated from the crypts. "Whose is it?" asked Brienne one evening. "My Uncle Brandon's," she replied, eyes still on the blade. "My Brandon took it from Uncle's tomb before he fled Winterfell. Now he wants me to return it." "Ah," she replied, understandingly. "Is that an important custom for House Stark?" Then Sansa nodded. "When the effigies are put over the tombs of our dead, we seal in their souls by placing their swords on their laps. It stops the ghosts from escaping. Even my father believed in it, but never Ice. Ice was handed from the Lord of Winterfell to his heir for generations." Brienne dropped her gaze, her face coloring as she discreetly nudged Oathkeeper beneath her mail skirt. "It wasn't your fault," Sansa was quick to assure her, "and I'd rather you have it than any Lannister. You're far more worthy than the Kingslayer." "That's very kind of you to say so, my lady." With that, Briag's expression closed off again. She always did when she felt she had exposed too much of her own personality. Sansa wondered at it, whether there was something dark and painful in her past that kept her running and concealing herself under that blank-eyed gaze. But she never overstepped the boundary so far as to ask. The following morning, they set off again, come dawn. Sansa picked up Brandon's old sword, sheathed it, and buckled it herself. Once mounted, they were on the move again. Bengierd and Tormund rode ahead of them, scouting the paths ahead for hostile free folk or whites, or worse, others. But their journey remained mercifully free of enemy hosts. Sansa could almost enjoy it now, seeing a place she never thought she would. On the fourth day, it was Melisandre who fell in line with her. Mounted on a donkey and wrapped only in a scarlet tunic, Sansa could only marvel at the priestess's ability to make her own heat. A useful trick, this far north. "Will you try to bring Jon back again?" asked Sansa. "He's breathing," replied Melisandre. "Which means he already is back. He's alive, but somewhere else." It was unhelpful, to say the least. Sensing her dissatisfaction, Melisandre added, "Jon has a purpose, and once that purpose is fulfilled, he will return to us completely." "And what did the three-eyed raven say to you before we left? Did he tell you why we need to be back at Castle Black before Jon reaches the Trident?" Sansa knew she was asking too many questions, and confirming those suspicions, Melisandre hesitated before answering. "Your brother will need me once he wakes up. My understanding is he will not be alone." Curiosity piqued, Sansa couldn't resist asking, "Who is he bringing back?" But Melisandre smiled. the smile of someone who knew, but wasn't telling. I look in the flames and see a woman birth 3 monstrous dragons from stone. Later, I see the same woman with 2 men. One of them is Jon Snow, but I do not know the other. Separately, they are powerful already. But joined together, winter itself flees before them. Sansa's mind whirled as she pieced the 3 people together. It was obvious. Daenerys, Jon and another Targaryen, Rhaegar. She thought to herself. What is Jon's link to the Targaryens? She asked. It's clear the 2 strangers I see have the blood of old Valyria in them. It's the most magical blood there is. I don't think he has any connection, she lied. Our Aunt Lyanna knew one. Lady Sansa, I have told you the truth, Melisandre pointed out. Despite herself, she felt the color rise in her face. He's the son of our Aunt Lyanna and Prince Rhaegar. I would have told you sooner, but the secret wasn't mine to tell. I understand, my lady, she replied. I am not surprised. So many things make sense in light of the truth. King Stannis had Targaryen blood, Sansa recalled. Is that why you thought he was the prince that was promised? If she didn't like being reminded of past mistakes, she didn't show it. That and other signs. But I was wrong. Even I misinterpret the flames from time to time. The following day, Benjen left them before they reached the wall. Sansa implored him to come home with them, thinking of the watchmen who would have remembered him and wondered what had become of him. But he took his leave anyway, promising to return to Bran and Mira at the tree, an assurance that soothed her worries for Bran. Once he was gone, however, she turned her attention to the tunnel beneath the wall, a sense of purpose growing in her once more. Right, she said. It's time. Seconds later, the voices of some men, keeping watch, called out a command. Brienne answered, followed swiftly by the sound of the ancient steel gates being winched open, granting their way in. Their journey had reached its end. Early in the morning, the 2 sides met, each army visible through a thin mist. Both hosts were huge, facing each other from barely a mile apart. Already Jon had lost Rhaegar among the royalist forces, but he knew he was at the front. Meanwhile, he himself held true to his promise and hung back, watching from a distance as the cavalry charge began. Suddenly, the thundering of horses' hooves shattered the silence, and sooner than he had imagined, the 2 sides met in a clash of steel and swords. Jon tried to walk forwards before a hand landed on his shoulder. He whirled around to where the 3-eyed raven stood beside him. The old man stood in silence, watching the battle unfold before him. You gave him the paste? Jon nodded. I told him it was an old northern recipe, and he was oddly grateful for it, even though he thought it was disgusting. The prince had tried not to grimace, though, which Jon thought was really rather gracious of him. Good. Now let's walk. They set off toward the battle together, getting closer to the main action. Both armies were still fully engaged, still fighting on land, but standing away from it like this made Jon feel bizarrely detached from it all. It was like he was looking at it through a window, like it was happening somewhere else. He could see Robert Baratheon's left flank smashing through royal lines, forcing them to retreat. Only, they couldn't retreat because the trident was getting in the way. They were caught between the Red Fork and the rebel forces. From what my father always told me, Robert smashed through royal lines with a few swings of his hammer. Jon remembered, but Rhaegar's not making it easy for them at all. The Raven chuckled. A classic example of history being written by the victors there, I think. Jon could hear the shouting, the cries of pain and death, grunts coming from the dying men. He could see swords piercing armor and men drowning in the ravenous tides of the river. But the longer it went on, the more distant he felt. It was like moving through a vivid dream. I wish it would stop, he said, at length. We know what's going to happen, and that only makes it worse. By the time they reached the edge of the fighting, it was clear which way this fight would go. Oddly, he wasn't alone in not participating. Various squires and boys too young to fight were crowding around, watching history form all around them. Jon hid easily among them, watching his bloodfather piss his life away in a cold and dreary river. He looked on, still strangely distant from it all, as Robert and Rhaegar squared up to each other directly. The prince had been pushed back into the water now, just as he had been told. Unhorsed, and with nothing to lose, he took Robert on with all his remaining strength. Just the 2 of them, Jon realized, no one else to be killed. Even so, the corpses were already banking up, not far away. Jon averted his gaze from the numerous dead, focusing on the final showdown between Rhaegar and Robert. The prince attacked first, lunging at Robert with an impressive thrust of the sword. Jon winced against the sound of the steel piercing breastplate. It might even have been enough to finish off any other man, but Robert Baratheon was a different matter. Although he recoiled, he gripped that hammer. The hammer Ned Stark couldn't even lift at all, and it arced gracefully through the air. The impact of it hitting the prince's body made even Jon recoil, teeth gritted. Then Rogor seemed to fall in slow motion, his blood father dead before he hit the water. Job done. The rebel forces regrouped within minutes, their march south now completely unimpeded. Now it felt real. Now it was really happening. Jon whipped around to where the three-eyed raven stood, only to find he had vanished. Suddenly, time seemed to move at thrice its normal speed, and he found himself running to the river edge and plunging into the freezing waters. He had to jump dead horses and clamber over a mound of corpses. He spat red water out of his mouth, wincing in disgust at the carnage all around him. He reached his father and pulled the helm off his head, exposing his face only for the bank of bodies to collapse and wash downriver. Panicked, Jon tried to pull Reeker away, but the ground gave way beneath his feet as he fell off a ledge in the riverbed. Holding his father under the arms, he tried to stay afloat as the tide carried them downwards. Unable to use his own arms, he kicked his feet as fast as he could, trying to keep both their heads above water. He was aiming for the riverbank, but the tide, suddenly loose after having been banked up with corpses, was pulling him downwards. Water closed over him, already breathless before he went under. His lungs began to burn, and the dead weight of his father only dragged him down deeper and faster. With no other choice, he released one of his arms and grasped at the water around him as if groping for a stronghold. He felt his fist curl around two of the rubies that had fallen from the prince's breastplate, and the world turned dark as his lungs gave out. Motionless in the depths of the water, it was far deeper than he ever imagined. He felt suspended in midair. There was only darkness, wet, cold, and dark. He had run out of time. "Swim," a small voice urged. "Just swim." Blind and getting weaker by the second, he pushed with all his might for the surface. Harder and harder. With Rucker's helpless body still gripped in one arm, he aimed for a dull speck of light that seemed miles above him. Daylight. It was something to aim for. So he did. Up and up, he kicked his legs and flailed his one free arm. But the dull speck of light never seemed to get any closer. He tried to cry out, but the water rushed into his mouth and filled his chest. All the while he swam, the darkness dispelling as he finally felt his fingertips break the surface of the water. With one final great effort, he heaved himself upwards and broke the surface, sucking in a great lungful of clean, pure air. He opened his eyes and jumped up, finding himself sudden naked on dry ground. Instinctively, he opened his clenched fist, and he dimly heard the rubies he had been clutching, hitting a wooden floor. Without seeing, he fell forwards as his knees buckled and his head swam with the sudden influx of air. Strong arms caught his fall, steadying him. "Lord Commander, Lord Commander," a man's voice bellowed. "Someone help. It's the Lord Commander." Jon opened his eyes to where a door was suddenly kicked open. It was Dolorous Ed. He looked between Jon and the man struggling to hold him upright, Ser Davos stunned into an uncharacteristic silence. After a second, he pulled himself together. "This gets better and better, this does," he said. "There's some bloke in black armor lying dead in the snow out there. No knows who is or where he's come from." Breathless and dazed, Jon clung to Ser Davos for dear life. His head was spinning like a child's top as he tried to get his bearings back. 1 minute he'd been drowning in the Trident, and then, in the blink of an eye, he was home again. It happened so fast his brain was struggling to keep up. Everything in his chambers looked the same. His bed, the fire, and the hangings on the wall. But it all felt so foreign to him now, like he'd dropped back into someone else's life. Worse, it was happening at once as word of his revival spread through Castle Black like wildfire. Ed acted fast. He wrenched the door open, and barked a command for the others to get back to what they were doing, then threw down the bar to secure them inside. Davos found a clean tunic and threw it over Jon's head, covering his nakedness. The feel of the soft wool against his cold skin snapped him out of his daze, and he managed to fall back onto the edge of the bed. "The man outside," he rasped through a parched throat. "You need to get him in here. It's urgent." Davos tried to reassure him. "It's all right. The boys will take care of him." He was cut off by the sound of banging on the door so hard it shook the dust from the rafters. Startled, Ed snapped at them to fuck off. All the same, Jon could still hear their voices. and the sound of their urgent footsteps pacing the wooden balcony beyond his door. While Davos was distracted, Jon pressed his advantage. Take him to the Meister's chambers and get Melisandre. I'll explain later. I swear, just do this for me now. Heedless of Ed's earlier warning, the banging resumed. Jon cast a nervous glance toward it. Could Azazar and Thorne have found out already? Probably. Or was he rotting in an ice cell? Jon hoped that was the case. Meanwhile, Ed opened the window and poked his head outside. Flushed with anger, I said, "Go fuck your," he broke off abruptly. "Oh, my lady. Where's Jon?" Sansa's voice was the smack in the face he needed to jolt him out of his panicked confusion. "Let her in, now." Davos had already taken the initiative and lifted the bar from the door, whereupon Sansa barreled through and descended upon Jon in a flurry of cloaks and a blur of her red hair. His strength returned to two at the sight of her, and he met her halfway in a tight embrace, affording them privacy. The other two retreated to an antechamber. "How do you feel?" she asked, drawing away from him. That was a valid question, considering he'd been technically dead and living in the past for what felt like years. The truth was, he didn't know. He couldn't say how he was meant to be feeling. Confused. He wasn't meant to be here. He should have been dead and burned a long time ago. He felt like a freak of nature. "Good," he lied. "I feel good. Better than Rakkar at any rate." A smile teased at the corners of her lips before she chuckled. It felt good to hear her laugh again. "What have you told them?" she asked. Jon felt his heart sink again. "I've not had time to tell them anything, yet." He paused, taking in the familiar sights of his chambers. "It's going to take some explaining. What's it like out there?" "I can feel how happy everyone is to have you back," she answered. "Honestly, those other men, the ones who did this to you, they've all been hanged." Jon felt his brow tighten. "All of them?" Sansa nodded. "All of them. Melisandre burned Alysar Thorne. She thought offering him as a sacrifice to her god would pay for your life. That was before she knew where you were." "What of Ollie?" he asked. "He was a boy, younger than Bran." "And he murdered you," Sansa reminded him, pointedly. "He was hanged with the rest, and he deserved it, Jon. He knew what he was doing when I thrust that knife into your heart." Jon knew he would have had to have done the same, so he wasn't about the fault, whoever had passed the sentence. But it was the betrayal that still cut deep. It didn't matter that he had, ultimately, survived, nor even that he'd lived through an experience so extraordinary he didn't think anyone would believe him. It always came down to the betrayal of his own brothers. They turned on him, just as they'd turned on the old bear Mormont. Mormont knew the watch had forgotten its purpose too, he said bitterly. With that, he slid off the side of the bed and began dressing himself properly behind a screen, so Sansa would not be uncomfortable. Soft woolen breeches, a clean undershirt, and fresh tunic had already been procured for him. His old boots had been cleaned and were warming by the fire. Sinking his feet into the hot, soft leather felt like heaven on his cold and calloused feet. That was a price he paid for endless rangings beyond the wall. Meanwhile, Sansa was fussing with something in the large oak wardrobe in the room. "I made this for you before I left, to find Bran," she said, holding up a fur-lined overcloak. "It's as close as I could make it to the one Father wore." The likeness was so close it made his heart pound. He could almost see his father wearing it. Taking it from her, Jon ran his hands along the pelts lining the collar, feeling the softness and warmth there. His fingertip probed the dire wolf embossed on the buckled straps that held it together, filled with a sudden sadness. "Thank you, Sansa," he said, trying to give it back. "Do really think I'm deserving. Now you know I am no true Stark." "You are to me," she insisted. "I made this for you, and no one else. If it were in my power, you'd be a Stark in name too." Jon couldn't begin to estimate how many times he had dreamed of being the Stark name as a child. He remembered the time King Stannis offered him the name in the castle, but honor and loyalty to the Night's Watch had compelled him to turn it down. The vows ran through his head once more. "I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father, no children. I shall wear no crowns." All the words were etched in his brain, and he remembered the first, "It shall not end until my death," and he had died. They had killed him. "And now my watch is ended," he murmured, taking the cloak in his hands. Silently, Sansa helped put it on, fastening the buckles in place so it fit perfectly. When they were children, they mocked Sansa for her devotion to needlework. The realization that she wasn't the only one capable of brattishness came as something of a surprise. "It's perfect," he added, kissing her forehead. "Thank you." Sansa took a backward step to take in the full effect, Despite his own misgivings, he felt his chest swell with pride. He almost felt like how he imagined Ned Stark felt when riding out of the gates of Winterfell. "We're not abandoning them," she said. Jon knew she meant the Watch. "When we take back Winterfell and unite the heads of the dragon, we will march north and north again. We will win the war against Winter, and what better way to fulfill your vows?" He had been feeling strangely guiltless about leaving the Night's Watch behind. His mind had been made up as soon as he realized what had happened. Still, he'd suspected that he would feel some regret, even shame, at leaving once he came around. But he had fulfilled his vows. He had served until his death, and he knew he could serve no more. And Sansa was right, they would be back with men and dragons. He knew he had little and less to be feeling guilty about. "Did you pass him on your way in?" he asked, looking back to Sansa. "Rosiragar, some of the brothers have already carried him to the Maester's chambers," she assured him. "Shall we go and see?" Dreading showing his face in public for the first time since his revival, Jon nodded and braced himself as she opened the door. Soon, a swarm of black rushed up to meet him as he descended the wooden stairs, his former brothers, all come to wish him well and shake his hand. A few looked deep into his eyes, making sure they hadn't turned icy blue, but soon enough, all were reassured, and the apprehension melted into easy laughs and warm embraces. Tormund almost crushed his ribs, but the big blond man he had not seen before gave him a hard look from where he guarded the Maester's chambers. A new recruit, he clearly had not yet taken his vows, but he looked strong and brawny, with a fierce countenance. Sansa beamed at the sight of him. "Jon," she said, gesturing to the man, "you've not yet met Lady Brienne of Tarth. She's my sworn sword." Embarrassment burst onto Jon's face in a blossoming red, so acute he feared Brienne might take one look at him and guess what he was thinking. "Blame it on the cold," he told himself, and pulled himself together. "An honor to meet you, my lady," he said, offering a hand, "and I thank you most sincerely for guarding my sister. Your sacrifice will not go unrewarded." Brienne looked affronted. "My sword is Lady Sansa's. I ask for no reward, my lord." He'd forgotten how prickly Southern knights could be about their service and honor. Her tone was a little spiky too, so Jon let it go. Instead, he nodded his thanks and stepped past her to enter the Master's chambers. As he passed, he noted the patch of snow turned red with blood and the glittering trail of red that led up to Amang's old door. The blood of the dragon froze and shone like the rubies fallen from the breastplate. Inside, they found Rilger laid out on a trestle table and stripped to his small clothes. For the first time, he could see the damage done to the prince's chest. Several ribs were broken. The jagged bones had burst through the skin and jutted outwards as if they were trying to escape the flesh that enclosed them. At his head and feet, braziers burned brightly, and Melisandre moved through the shadows that shifted against the back wall. Jon spotted her first and drew a deep breath. "Is there anything you can do?" He directed the question at the Red Woman. "Not I, Lord Commander," she replied, her voice heavy with the accents of the East. "The Lord of Light will heal him. But you're his instrument," he pointed out. He was sick of people mincing their words around him. "What I mean to ask is, he's not beyond repair." "Nothing is beyond repair for the Lord of Light," she answered. Her words were followed by the splashing of water as she wrung out a linen cloth. "Something needs to be done about his chest before he's brought back." Jon looked again at the gaping wound. Beneath the jagged bones, he could see Rhaegar's cold, motionless heart. Small wonder the blow had killed him almost outright. Then he remembered. It had been Donal Noy who forged Robert Baratheon's famous warhammer. Like the king who wielded the weapon, Noy was dead and gone. He had seen it himself, the night the wildlings attacked Castle Black. Had he not, Jon imagined that Rhaegar's awakening would have been even more awkward than it was already. Once again, Jon turned to Melisandre. "May I?" She placed the wet cloth in his hands, whereupon Jon took it and began washing his father's wounds. He tried to be delicate, at first, dabbing the cloth around the edges of the ruined flesh until he remembered Rhaegar was feeling nothing where he was. Feeling emboldened, Jon pressed harder and wrung the linen out before forcefully wiping away the caked blood. Most was still soft from the waters of the Trident and the snows he had lain in, but close to the open wound the gore had hardened. As he worked, he looked down into Rhaegar's face. His indigo eyes were closed. His mouth, too. His small nose looked upturned, and his brow was smooth. He looked half a boy who'd simply fallen into a deep sleep. But the last remnants of warmth had fled him already, and his flesh was icy cold to the touch, and the color of milk glass. Just then, Sansa joined him and smoothed back the prince's silver-gold curls. He was the sort of knight she would have gone weak at the knees for, not so long ago. Now she regarded the prince with a look reminiscent of a concerned septa. "When he wakes, what will you tell him?" Sansa asked. "Jon, honestly hadn't thought of that. I wish I knew some way to say it gently, but no words can couch the news that your entire family is dead. But for a sister and son, you never knew." Jon sluiced the water and resumed washing in small circles, carefully caressing the prince's shattered chest. As he worked methodically, he found himself aching for Maester Aemon again. He was a Targaryen. Ancient, wizened, and blind as he was still the blood of the dragon. One of their dynasty's final embers, forgotten at the wall with just his quiet dignity and quieter memories to keep him warm during the endless northern nights. Jon wished he had known the truth while the old Maester still lived. Now all those memories and all that knowledge was lost to him forever. Before he could stop it, a tear rolled down his nose and dripped off the end, splashing into Rhaegar's open wound. "How do you know he won't end up in the past, like I did?" he asked, turning to Melisandre and composing himself. "Because now I know the truth," she replied, reaching into her left sleeve and withdrawing some powder. She tossed it into the brazier's flames, causing a small explosion among the fire. "Yours is the blood of old Valyria, Jon Snow, the blood of the dragon. Although Rilhorod undoubtedly had a purpose for you, the fires I used to perform the magic weren't nearly powerful enough. It worked, just not enough to bring you back fully. For your father, whose blood is much purer, the fires will be greater still." It still made little sense to Jon, but he could see the reasoning. His dragon blood was interspersed with the blood of the Starks, whereas Rhaegar was a product of pure Valyrian inbreeding. Frowned upon by most, but positively encouraged by his near ancestors. Even when starting to understand more about why the Targaryens kept the line pure, he still couldn't quite bring himself to stomach it. "They used blood magic at Summerhall," he told the Red Woman. "The night after I hatched the dragon there, I noticed that my wounds had finally healed. Will the same happen to him?" Melisandre smiled. "It is to be hoped, Jon Snow." Not long after that, Sansa touched his hand to get his attention. "You're forgetting someone who's missed you very much." She smiled knowingly as a certain dire wolf began scratching at the door. "Ghost," he called out, rushing to be reunited with his most faithful of companions. It began at nightfall when the moon peeked shyly from a gap in the black clouds and turned the wall to silver. Castle Black's forecourt was near empty, the smithy and armory locked up secure, and most of the watchmen confined to barracks for the duration. Jon could see them watching from the windows, but did not mind. A handful of others, ones he still trusted, were on watch atop the wall. Dolorous Ed, Satin of Old Town, and a few others. They were augmented by the scarecrows dressed in black they'd once used to kid the wildlings into thinking they had more men than they did. Davos Seaworth, Brienne of Tarth, and Sansa were the only official spectators, while Melisandre herself patrolled the perimeter of her towering fire. Jon followed her. A flaming torch flickered in his hands as he attempted to read the look on the priestess's face. Her red eyes were distant, as though she had internally retreated far away. But as always, the ruby fixed at her throat glowed red, making its own light and heat. Up this close, Jon could almost feel it. "If I'd known the fire would be a big one, I'd have brought some taters along," Ed had dryly commented as he passed on his way to the wall. "I bet that Lord of Light can crisp 'em up good and proper." Jon had laughed, but Melisandre had turned to them and narrowed her eyes in disdain. Both men fell silent and serious like scolded boys as she rebuked. "The Lord of Light has no need of taters, Ser Dolorous." "I've been called many things in my life, but never Ser," Ed mumbled as he went on his way. After bidding him farewell, Jon turned his attention back to the skeletal structure of the fire. There were two separate columns, several feet apart, with Rhaegar laid out between them on a trestle table. His body was wrapped in pelts to ward off the frost. But if the size of the two wood columns was anything to go by, frost wasn't going to be a problem for long. Jon could only look at the size of them and wonder how the conflagration wouldn't take up Rhaegar's body with it. "Are you going to tell us who he is and how he came to be here?" It was Davos who'd asked the question. Jon turned to his left to find the old smuggler at his shoulder. "Before King Stannis raised me up and made me a knight and then a lord, I used to do a brisk trade around the Blackwater. I knew Dragonstone like the back of my hand. As if proving a point, he studied said hand and splayed his shortened fingers. I knew every rock, every post along those curtain walls, and everyone who lived within those same walls, although naturally they never saw me. Jon knew where he was going. Forgive me, Sir Davos. Since I woke up, there's been no time. I understand, Davos assured him. Truly I do. If I was seeing what I'm seeing now, when I look at that man, I'd think I was losing my wits. That was before I came to know the Red Woman. However, Jon laughed wryly. You and I both, Sir Davos. Davos kept his eyes trained on the prince's body. It's him, isn't it? Rhaegar Targaryen. It is, Jon confirmed, turning to look into the grizzled knight's eyes. Once he's safely back, I'll tell you everything. I promise, Sir Davos. Davos placed his mutilated hand on Jon's shoulder, giving it a brief and tight squeeze. In your own good time, Lord Commander. He had already informed everyone that he was no longer Lord Commander, but this time Jon had to go. Thanking the man, he stepped back to Melisandre's side and watched as she reached into her dagged sleeve and scattered some powder over both pyres. With that, she glanced up into the sky. It is time, Jon Snow, she said. In response, his nerves prickled and he felt the hairs at the back of his neck standing on end. Drawing a deep, steadying breath, he touched the flame of his torch to the kindling of the first column, and then the second. The kindling crackled faintly at first. It seemed there was more smoke than fire. Then, after a moment's pause, the fire took hold with a great whoosh. A wall of heat folded around them, pushing Jon back within a minute. He retreated to the sidelines, where Sansa and Brienne stood and watched the ritual in silence. By the time they shuffled aside to make room for him, there were twin towers of fire and flames of orange and red licking the night sky. Where he had been pushed back by the heat, Melisandre remained in place. The ruby at her throat caught Jon's eye as it flashed and glowed, while its wearer sang out at the top of her voice. He knew no High Valyrian and could understand little of what was being said, but he could guess the general gist of it as Relhord was evoked from the heart of the conflagrations. He himself looked into the flames as they reached for the stars above. It was so bright that even the wall itself reflected the oranges, reds, and scarlets of the fire. It looked half alive as it began to weep. Jon's nerves twisted at the sight of the melt, but with winter upon them, he knew it would have frozen again by morning. Next to him, Sansa was awe of the sights before her. Her gaze danced between the twin columns of fire and the light show the wall was playing out. While poor Brienne must have been cooking inside her armor, every inch of Castle Black was alive with the light of the fires that now met and formed an interwoven arc of fine, gossamer threads of flames over the Prince Rhaegar's body. The pelts that covered his body appeared to have been burned away, leaving him naked to the intense inferno that now shrouded him. Jon watched him intently for signs of life, but could only see how small he looked when shrouded in fire. Melisandre, still completely unaffected by the heat surrounding her, moved to the space between the columns, just at the foot of Rhaegar's body, her chanted prayers heard clearly above the roar of the fire, repeated over and over as she cast the powder from her sleeves into the heart of each column. The fire and consuming him, Sansa whispered in his ear. Jon shifted to get a better look. Now the flames had completely obscured him from view. A cocoon of interwoven, crisscrossing flames that danced and weaved all about him. The fires she lit for you were nothing like this, said Sir Davos as he reappeared at Jon's side. Blood of old Valyria, isn't he? Jon answered. Still, he felt a little shortchanged. I would have got the same had she known the truth. What truth? Davos asked. Jon almost cursed himself. I'll tell you once this is all over. And it seemed it was almost over, as Melisandre raised her hands and cried out an invocation to Relhord. In response, the flames parted again to form two distinct towers of fire on either side of the prince's body. Jon breathed a sigh of relief as Rhaegar appeared whole again, unharmed by the conflagration that had briefly engulfed him. Meanwhile, Melisandre approached the prince and leaned down close to his face and kissed him. A long, lingering kiss as she breathed the life back into his motionless body. Jon's breath hitched in his throat as he moved closer, not daring to breathe, as the ritual reached its zenith. A boy's voice he did not recognize sounded from the ether. Rhaegar, open your eyes. A raven squawked its echo. Eyes, eyes, eyes. It had 3 of them. From the tips of his fingers, the warmth spread slowly out to the rest of his body. Strangely, it seemed to him the last he remembered he had hit the water. He breathed Liane's name, thinking it lost to the gushing current of the trident. Now all he felt was the warmth, the flames lapping at his naked skin like a lover's tongue. He wanted to open his eyes to see what he was feeling, but he hadn't the strength, and he was lost to his dreams. Robert's warhammer smashed his into breastplate. He thought the strange tinkling was his teeth falling out, but it was only the decorative rubies from his armor dropping into the water. "I thought that I had killed him with a single sword thrust, father," he said in his head, and hoped Aerys could hear it. But then a voice answered his silent plea. "Promise me you'll look after him," said Lyanna. Rosier's heart suddenly pounded at the sound of her voice. "Robert will kill him. You know, he will. Promise me, Ned. Promise me." Her pleas faded and Ned didn't answer. Rhaegar tried to move again, but the warmth held him fast. Behind the lids of his closed eyelids, he could make out yellows, oranges, and bright reds, all merging and intermingling. It was so beautiful, he wanted to see it and touch it. He tried to move a hand, but couldn't. So strength, weak as a damn kitten. The cracking noise was deafening, like the roof of Summerhall collapsing on the diners all over again. But still he didn't move. When he tried to open his eyes again, he saw a huge black dragon. Balerion, the Black Dread, rise above King's Landing and spread his wings like a monstrous black shadow. Is that Aegon the Conqueror riding him? But the dragon rider he saw was a silver-haired girl. Not even a woman grown, just a girl. Mounted on that enormous dragon, 2 riderless dragons appeared, and his own voice reminded him, "The dragon has 3 heads." The scene shifted and his father's voice echoed down the decades. "Burn them all! Burn them all!" Ice plains opened up before him, and he looked to the north, where eyes as blue as burning ice looked back at him, scaring him out of his wits. "Burn them all," his father's voice bellowed in his head, resounding over and over like his brain was an empty echo chamber. A boy he met a long time ago, his name was John, stood at the head of a vast army, leading them through the snow with a flaming sword. A beautiful girl with auburn hair and blue eyes turned loose a dragon which burst from beneath the ground in a hail of stone and fire. A gray-eyed girl, Lyanna, ran a blade across an old man's throat, blood spilling hot and bright over her finger. Rosier's head spun again, making him dizzy even if he was lying down in his bed of fire. When he came to, there was a wedding, but he was not seated with the guests. He looked over his shoulder to where the shadows shifted and a woman stepped into the pale light. Hooded and cloaked, what flesh he could see was the color of curdled milk, and deep red gouges ran the length of her cheeks. It was as if she wept blood. In her hands she toyed with an iron crown of miniature swords. The look in her dead eyes made his blood run cold as something unseen covered his mouth and blew into his lungs. For a moment he felt like he was being physically inflated. Jolted, he leapt to his feet to try and right his balance. Finally, he opened his eyes and met the gaze of a woman whose own eyes were red, deep red, like her hair and clothes. A ruby glowed at her throat, and he looked up to see 2 giant columns of fire burning either side of him. Gasping for air, his legs would not hold him, and the woman had to help get him away from the fires. As he moved, he became dimly aware of others watching from a distance. Unable to stagger any further, he collapsed on the ground and hit the snow as a cloak was thrown over him. "Your Grace," a man's voice called. "Your Grace, you're back." He knew this man. "John," he gasped, finding his throat parched. "John, you were at the Trident with me." Shaking, confused, and scared. Rosier looked all about him, from the fire to the great wall of ice that towered over them all. "What the—" he thought to himself. All he could see was the fire and ice, and the ice and fire. Rosier shivered as he pushed back the furs that had been covering him. His back ached in protest as he rolled off the hard bed he'd woken up in, and he had to grab the wooden post to stop his knees from giving out. Once his balance was righted and his head stopped spinning, he stood trembling in the cold and tried to get his bearings. It was dark still, and the fire in the hearth had burned down to little more than glowing embers. Beyond the window, the pale moonlight showed him a heavy snowfall, silent and soft in what seemed the dead of night. Suddenly aware of another man sleeping deeply nearby, he pulled a fur cover from the bed and wrapped himself up in it. He found his own clothes still heaped in the corner of the room, but they were caked with dried blood and dirt from the battlefield, Wondering if the whole fight had been some vivid fever dream, he picked up his tunic and ran his hand over the dried black blood once more. He found it to be very real. There was no mistaking the wall, either. He could see it from the window, glinting silver in the moonlight. All 700 foot of it towered above the chamber he found himself in, bewilderment closing in as his wits returned to him. Frowning out at the snowfalls, he recalled waking up in a fire. Twin columns of fire towering over him, so close he really should have been burned to a crisp within minutes of the kindling going up. Before that, he had been on the Trident. He thought he had delivered a mortal blow to Robert Baratheon, only to see the Stormlord rise again with his fist wrapped around the shaft of that deadly hammer. It played out in his mind again, a slow-motion arc as the head of the hammer smashed into his chest, recalling again the sensation of being knocked into the middle of next week. Did I hear the ribs break, or did I only feel it? The memory confused the sensation, but it still made his stomach turn. Iaxlia. She was still in King's Landing, the last he knew. He asked the Red Woman and Jon Snow if they had heard anything about Aiaia and the children. In response, all he got was water laced with dream wine, sending him into a deep, uncontrollable sleep from which he had only just awoken. Lyanna would be safe in Dorne, he knew. Robert would have little and less interest in storming a castle well beyond the Red Mountains. But Aiaia, Egan, and Rhaenys, Aerys could shift for himself. To distract himself from his darkening thoughts, he found some chopped wood by the hearth and fed it to the dying fire. The coals collapsed in on themselves, sending a shower of sparks up the stone chimney and causing the sleeper nearby to roll over and snort as he awoke. Rochergor whipped around to where Jon Snow now sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Your Grace," he said in a voice thick with sleep. "Why didn't you wake me?" "I didn't want to disturb you," he lied. In reality, he wanted just a moment alone to process what was happening and where he seemed to be. Not that it had achieved anything, but it was worth a try. "Jon, how did I get here? What's going on?" Still fully dressed, the other man was able to get up and move to the fireside to warm his hands. "How long was I unconscious for?" asked the prince. "Long enough for you to bring me from the Riverlands to the Wall, it would seem. Is this the way of it? Now? Robert's won his little war, so now my only hope is to take the Black." His mind was racing through the likeliest explanations, but it wasn't long before he lapsed into thinking aloud. "And what of my children? I think the Martells would take them in and protect them, no matter what. Robert wouldn't be able to reach them in Dorne, but none of this was Mother's doing." "Your Grace." After Jon abruptly cut over him, Rosier trailed off into silence. Perched on the edge of the bed he'd not long woken up in, he looked up at the other man and tried to read his expression. Jon's face was turned toward the reviving flames. His fingers splayed out to catch the warmth in his hands. Meanwhile, his brow was knotted as he seemed to wrestle some difficult dilemma. The longer the silence went on, the more Rosier worried. "I know how hard this is," Jon finally spoke. "It was hard for me too. When I woke up in the Mountains of the Moon, I had no idea where I was. One minute I was here at Castle Black, a knife in my heart. Then I was leagues away on a mountainside in a place I'd never been before in my life." Rosier studied his profile intently as he spoke, trying to comprehend what he was saying. "Your knife wounds. You were stabbed here, and just woke up in the Vale, just as I was." "Killed," Jon butted in again, turning from the fire to face him. "You and I were both killed. The Red Woman Melisandre brought us both back." Stunned, Rhaegar was lost for words. "That was nice of her. But why the Mountains of the Moon for you and Castle Black for me?" He knew full well that he ought to have been dead, but not that he actually was dead. Remembering the fires again, he recalled now the moment he woke up when he felt the air being blown back into his lungs. It explained a few things, but the questions still buzzed in his head, an angry and confused swarm of questions. Only one shouted louder than the others. "Where are my children? I have 2 1/3 on the way. You know Lyanna's condition." Jon flinched, something Rhaegar took for a less than promising sign. Finally, he answered, "You need to let me explain." "I'm all ears," Rosier retorted. Beneath the fur he was wrapped in, one hand found the patch of scarring on his chest, the remnants from the hammer blow that had killed him. It was a rough, twisting scar from his breast to his hip. It felt old. "You knew I should have been dead," Jon continued. "You saw the knife wound right over my heart, and you even told Lyanna about it. But instead of dying, I woke up close to the awry in the path of the Starks as they made their way to Harrenhal. Instead of dying, I was sent there to find her and you. It would have been easier to ask Lord Commander Corgyle for leave to come south and meet us. Rogai jested in vain. It was nervous talk which he regretted instantly. Sorry, continue please. Jon's expression softened. I could have done that had you not been dead for 18 years. I woke up in the past, and now you have woken up in the future. Rosier felt himself turning rigid as he ran that sentence through his head once more, then twice more. He tried to make sense of it before deciding he hadn't heard Jon's words right. "See, come again," he stammered. Jon turned fully from the fire before repeating himself, word for word. Then he added, "That's what I meant by being sent to find you. I had to find you and save you without changing history. The ink is dry, but I was able to just smudge it a little." A number of reactions all came crashing in at once. Anger, disbelief, and confusion were prominent among them, but it all converged to form a numbness that spread from head to toe. In his shock, he had let the fur fall from his shoulders, only for Jon to reach over and fix it back in place again. Meanwhile, Rogier latched onto the first piece of information that made sense to him. So, this moment in time where I'm sitting here and talking to you is 18 years after the Battle of the Trident. For what it was worth to him, Jon looked utterly befuddled too. "Yes, it's 18 years later, Your Grace." "No," Rogier retorted. "No, it cannot be. It's impossible. I mean, how could you find yourself 18 years in the past?" He wanted to go on, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if his mind had taken in so much and had now spent its capacity with too much on board already. What was there began to get all mixed up in his brain. "Mayhaps your grace has been told enough for one day," ventured Jon, cautiously. Rosier did not answer. Instead, he got back to his feet and crossed the room to where the window looked out over the forecourt. Stopping at the mullion, he glared intently at the breaking dawn, as if he might see the time and exact date noted somewhere, as proof to what Jon was telling him. But all he saw was snow, ice, and men in black making their way down from night watch along the wall. They looked a bedraggled lot, with their shoulders hunched and heads bent against the skirling winds. Nowhere, however, could Rosier find proof of the date. This could be any dawn, anywhere. "Your Grace," Jon's voice was soft, his hand gentle as it touched his shoulder. "Come and sit down." Tentative now, Rosier turned from the window. "There's more, isn't there?" 18 years worth of more, a voice in his head pointed out. A lump formed in his throat as he thought of Rhaenys, Aegon, and the little infant he had not yet met. And may never meet, that same voice pointed out. Just a little bean growing in Lyanna's belly, growing up without a father. They would all be adults now, with no living memory of him, their father, unless— "Where are my children?" he asked again, voice barely a whisper. A question asked so quietly because he found himself shit-scared of the answer. Jon swallowed, his eyes clouding as he briefly averted his gaze. Rosier realized then that the other man was afraid of telling him, or trying to find some way of couching the truth. In the end, he selected just one word. Dead. Just one word that told so much more, snuffed out so much hope, and ended even the vainest of hopes. Dead. How? You don't need to know. How? Put to the sword by Gregor Clegane? A Lannister man. Rhaegar cut in again. I knighted him myself. Once again, his own anger and grief stole the words from him. "And Elia in Lyanna?" he asked, at length. Jon hesitated again. Lyanna died giving birth, but Gregor Clegane raped and murdered Elia after the sack of King's Landing. Rosier's eyes narrowed as his stomach roiled at what happened to Elia. Jon was still talking, imploring him to sit and rest, but he was no longer listening. The horror overwhelmed him, and soon his empty stomach was heaving its bile over the wood-paneled floor. There was a chamber pot beneath the bed, but he didn't make it in time. While he heaved and retched again, Jon knelt beside him. The sickness abated before long, but he continued shaking violently, kneeling in the cold bile. "I did this," he said, as the awful truth dawned on him. "I did this, so the gods have hauled me back into this life as penance. I must live again while they are all dead." "Is that the way of it, Jon Snow?" Jon hesitated. "Lyanna's son lives." "Where?" he demanded, latching on to that one small ray of hope. He heard Jon swallowing again, lapsing into that terrible silence that normally presaged something twice as terrible. Whatever it was, Rhaegar wished he would spit it out. After the war, Robert wanted all Targaryens dead, Jon finally explained. But Lyanna's brother, Lord Eddard, found her at the Tower of Joy as she lay dying. The baby, a boy, was healthy, but she knew Robert would kill him. So she made Lord Stark promise to take him back to Winterfell and raise him as his own, never telling a soul the truth. Not even Lady Stark ever knew, less still the boy himself. He grew up thinking he was a bastard, gotten on some tavern whore during the war. He is a prince of the realm, Rhaegar insisted, vehemently. Not some bastard. He knows that now, Jon assured him, quickly. But he believed Ned Stark was his father, and Lyanna's name was simply never mentioned. Rhaegar buried his face in his hands, stopping the tears that threatened to spill. He resolved himself to not weep, to show no self-pity for the chaos he had left behind. But he still shook, and his breaths were still shallow and ragged as his heartbeat palpitated. "Where is he now? I must find him," he said, eventually. Jon's gaze dropped, and Rhaegar realized, in that moment, the truth that had been staring him in the face since he woke up. "Jon," he said, voice quavering, "why were you, in particular, sent back to find me? Is it what I am thinking?" Jon's gaze met his own. He was so much like Lyanna that it took his breath away. Even now, among all this pain, shame, and guilt, when Jon spoke again, it sounded as if he, too, were finally becoming overwhelmed with it all. "I didn't know," he said. "I had no idea until I went back and it all began making sense. I had to learn the truth and bring you back. I'd have brought every one of you back if it was in my power. Lockleah, mine own mother, who I ached to know every day of my life. You, the princess, Elia, the brother and sister I never knew I had. If the power was mine, we would all be here and now, living and restored." Rhaegar's breath hitched at the thought of it, a tear finally breaking through the barriers he put up. It was a beautiful picture. Oh, to have the power to step back in time and just rescue them all, bringing them forwards to a place of safety and refuge, all but Aerys, who he hoped was being hounded through all 7 hells for all eternity. "But why me?" he asked, looking to Jon. "To hell with me. I would die 100 deaths if it meant my Rhaenys and my Aegon lived. You could have your brother and sister and be free of the parents who condemned you to live this life." Jon looked saddened by his question. "But it's not that simple. You are the prince that was promised, and the realm needs you now more than it ever did before. It's not one person, but 3. The dragon has 3 heads. None of that seemed to matter anymore. Not to Rhaegar. All his family were gone, save for a man grown who claimed to be his last living son. It had been his fixation with the prophecy that had, in part, led him to this moment. He knew, he could see that now, as clear as day, despite his fondness for blaming Aerys for everything. "There are 2 of us." 3, Jon corrected. "Your sister, Daenerys Targaryen." "I don't have a brother." Rhaegar cut himself off as he remembered his mother's pregnancy. His father had raped the baby into her shortly before they fled Dragonstone. "I do have a sister." A smile pulled at the corner of Jon's mouth. "She grew up on the run in Essos. These days they call her the Mother of Dragons." Rhaegar frowned. "What?" "She hatched 3 of them," Jon explained. Further, 3 live dragons, but with no other Targaryens to ride them but us. Together, we are the heads of the dragon. You knew all along, although you could not identify us immediately. "You brought a dragon egg to Winterfell," Rhaegar recalled. Jon shrugged. 3 heads and a spare. He paused before adding, "All of this, everything that's happening to you, is a lot to take in, too much, all at once. You need to rest, to clear your head, and let it all sink in." He was right. All Rhaegar knew for sure was that his emotions were fighting their own war now. 1 minute anger, then guilt, then sorrow and shame. All of it. It left him drained and numb, and he could no more form an opinion right now than fly without wings. His mouth tasted like something had died in it, and his head was aching. The sun had barely risen, and already the day felt like it had gone on too long. However, before Jon reached the door, Rhaegar called him back. "You're my son." Halfway out the door, letting in a cold white wind, Jon looked back. "You're my real father, but you'll never be Eddard Stark." "He was good to you?" asked Rhaegar. "The best," answered Jon. "Then that's all that matters," he said. "But it hurt." It hurt more than any hammer blow that the gods had brought him back with no family and a son who would never see him as a father. Rosier could almost hear their laughter. Jon found Sansa in the common hall, breaking her fast on oatmeal and honey. Brienne of Tarth was beside her, a wall of shining steel with big blue eyes, seemingly on guard duty already. She wasn't eating and stuck to staring at the wall. Not far away, Jon noted Tormund Giantsbane making eyes at the big woman. More than that, he was openly gaping at her and totally ignoring Ser Davos, who was attempting to make conversation. Lady Brienne had an admirer. "Were you with the prince?" asked Sansa quietly. Jon nodded. The conversation had left him drained. "How is he?" "As well as any man who's just found out almost all his family are dead," he replied, rather more brusquely than he intended. "Sorry, Sansa, I did not mean it like that." Sansa colored. "It was a stupid question." She returned to her food while Jon fetched some for himself. They ate in silence while Jon went through the conversation again. There was still so much left to tell the prince, but too much at once, and he feared he would be pushed over the edge. Just the fates of his children and the women he had loved was enough. There was still so much that even he didn't know. "Sansa, did you ever find out more about Petyr Baelish's involvement in the First War?" he asked, glancing over the table at her. She thought on it for a moment, watching the honey drip off the comb in her fingers. "Not since leaving Bran, and I know he's concentrating on the dragon, but I know how to use the trees now, so I can start again today, if you like." Jon nodded. "Please do. If he was involved, then I want solid answers to give to Rhaegar. He's already blaming himself, I think." Sansa nodded her assent, then set her bowl aside to make room for Lady Melisandre. The Red Woman never ate. Not that Jon had ever noticed, but she joined them all the same, and soon after her, Ghost hopped up onto Jon's bench and curled up beside him. Still early days after his return, he still felt a rush of happiness when the direwolf was in his sight. He stopped eating to ruffle his fur and nuzzle the soft space between his glowing red eyes. "Now that we're all back, but missing one head of the dragon," he declared, turning back to his companions, "we need to secure the north in preparation for the real war." Sansa was toying with the honey again, ladling it onto her wooden spoon, then letting it slowly drip back into her uneaten oatmeal. Only now, she was smiling faintly to herself. "I propose we send ravens to each of the great houses who might still support us," he began, laying out his early plans. Focusing on something he was familiar with helped drive away the pain that morning's talk with Rhaegar had caused him. "I think Mormont, Umber, Manderley, Glover, Hornwood, and Serwyn would be worth a start. Maybe even Alice Karstark can forgive us for Robb heading her lord. Perhaps if they know about the dragon, it can help win them over." "No," Sansa cut in. "Sonar must be our secret. If anyone else finds out word we get back to Ramsay, and he would send his men down there to kill him." Jon shrugged, but they'd never kill a dragon. "If Ramsay sends his men down there, he'd be doing our job for us." "Enough men can kill a dragon, Jon Snow," Melisandre pointed out. "Sonar is not indestructible. Lady Sansa has the right of it." Jon saw the sense in that. "Very well, but we still need Rhaegar to go down there and turn the dragon loose." "Rosier won't find it in 100 years, Jon," Sansa pointed out. "He's deep below the crypts, and Rhaegar's never even seen Winterfell before." He suppressed a sigh. "Well, I can't do it. I need to lead the army on the field, and somehow, I don't think Ramsay Bolton is going to let me nip into the crypts a while." "Brain can skin change," Sansa suggested. Even that Jon was uneasy with. "Whenever Ghost is on the opposite side of the wall to me, I lose all connection with him. Bran is on the wrong side of the wall for our dragon. We can't take the risk, so someone needs to get down there and free him." No one volunteered immediately, but Jon could tell by the look on her face that Sansa was about it. She opened her mouth to reply, so he cut her off before she could so much as form the first word. "No," he said brusquely. "No and no again. Father would come back and haunt me if I let anything happen to you." "Jon, listen," she snapped. "All I need do is slip through the gates and into the crypt. I know exactly where the dragon is and how to free him. The dragon knows me. He trusts me." Jon could scarcely believe what he was hearing. "Ramsay will have you locked up the moment you set foot in there." "Ramsay will be on the battlefield," Sansa pointed out hotly. "Let me do this, Jon. I know I can." Before Jon could reply, Melisandre broke in. "Ramsay Bolton will never recognize her." She reached into one of her dagged sleeves, where she had kept the powder the night before, and withdrew a small ruby. Placing it on the trestle table where all could see it, Jon eyed it curiously. It was much like any other ruby, but not the one at her throat which seemed to glow and pulse in time to the beat of her heart. This was just a regular ruby. "Is that Rygargar's?" he asked, quietly. Even Brienne of Tarth stopped staring straight ahead and turned to glance at the mystery gemstone. "There is power in King's blood, Jon Snow," said Melisandre. Rosier wore it at the Trident, and he'd certainly spilled his blood on those stones that day. But Jon was still perplexed. Still, he ventured a guess. "She wears that, and Ramsay will be so dazzled by the light he won't be able to see her face." To his surprise, Melisandre smiled. "Something like that." Jon was mystified but remained adamant. "I don't care what tricks you and Rosier have up those dagged sleeves of yours, my lady. No matter what, I will not allow Ramsay Bolton within a league of my sister ever again. Not for Winterfell, not for anything." Having suddenly lost his appetite, he pushed back the bench he was sat on and strode out of the common hall. Ghost loped at his heels, and he ignored Sames's pleas for him to return. Sister, cousin, whatever she was to him now, she was all he had left in the world except a father who didn't know him and a brother on the wrong side of the wall. From the common hall, he went straight to his chambers and fetched Longclaw from its hook on the wall. Now that he was back, it was time he got back into his training. More so, now he had a castle to take back. The sword was where he left it, and he grabbed it without looking, marching straight back to the training yard with it in his hands, still sheathed. "I was looking for that sword everywhere," Davos said as he left the hall. Jon had to laugh. It was roughly 18 years ago. With me. The grizzled knight shook his head in bewilderment. "I don't think I'll ever get my head around all that business, my lord. You'd think I'd be used to all this mad stuff happening with Melisandre around, but she's never ceased to shock me." "Shock you?" Jon repeated. "I would imagine you're not a man who is easily shocked, sir." Davos laughed. "You'd be right about that." He paused, drawing his own sword. "I'm not as young as I was, and I never was a great swordsman. Humor me, and give us a round. I'm thinking I could use the practice." Jon agreed readily. "All right then, but consider yourself warned, old man." Laughing, he reached for Longclaw's hilt and found it surprising hot to the touch. Curious, he glanced down at the scabbard and saw that it was blackened and scorched. The wood was black at the edge. The leather almost melted into the grain, but when he drew the blade, it was as perfect as ever. It was hot, but not so hot that he couldn't touch it. "What's the matter?" asked Ser Davos, when he tarried too long. "Lost heart already." Jon showed him the burned scabbard. "Strange. It must have been too close to the hearth fire." Yes, he thought, that must be it. Rhaegar had no notion of where he was going. He simply let his feet guide him through the tunnel beneath the wall and out the other end. Then he walked on, following the setting sun without seeing the burning golden horizon. He was dimly aware of the snow packing around his new boots and settling on the shoulders of his new black cloak. He dressed like a brother of the Night's Watch because they had far more boots, cloaks, and clothes than they had men to fill them. So on he walked. He intended to only for so long as the wall was within his sight, or the braziers that burned along the top. Now that darkness had begun to settle. While he walked, he lost track of time and never had much sense of purpose even before he set out. It was the sight of the heart tree in the Godswood that stopped him, though, if it had a pool, it was long frozen over and snowed on top of that. But the leaves of the weirwood were ruby-red heads, banging from the silver-white branches. In his mind's eye, he could see Lyanna sitting quietly beneath its boughs, just as he had 100 times at Harrenhal. But Harrenhal was a southern tree, whereas the one before him now is of the north. He approached it cautiously, lowering himself against the trunk so that the carved face was next to his own. If he looked from the tail of his eye, he could just about get the wooden face in sight. His own gods had been conspicuous by their absence. Since Robert won the war, perhaps the old gods were listening. He remembered then something Lyanna once told him, that the dead northerners' souls go into the trees. "Are you in there now, Lyanna? Can you hear me now?" he asked, turning so he was within kissing distance of the tree's face. "Can you see me now, mine own heart?" He searched the sap, weeping eyes of the tree, his own eyes weeping regular tears that froze on his cheeks, but nothing changed. No glimmer of hope, nor trace of recognition. "What about you, Rhaenys?" he asked, his voice cracking as he remembered her again. He lowered his head, eyes closed, As he did so, a pair of guileless brown eyes met his own. He tried to look closer, but they faded away, and only the red, sapped eyes of the tree remained. Still, he reached out and pressed his hand softly to the face of the tree, as if she could feel him, and continued, "Maybe you would not come to a place like this, but they say there's power in the trees. Maybe you can hear me, wherever you are, and your mother and brother too." "If not for the blood in your veins, you would have been a woman grown now," he told her, but he suspected she already knew. "Your brother a man with princes of his own, who is to say, I can't imagine you with children of your own. I can't imagine you as a wife, with your own household, because I could never have imagined you gone from my life. But you are gone, and I know it was my fault." He fell silent, leaning back on his heels as memories swept over him. Meanwhile, a soft breeze sighed through the branches of the tree, making the ruby-red trees shiver beneath the silent snowfall. Roger lifted his face, watching as the pure white flakes whispered through the space above him. There were so many things his children could have been by now, Rosie especially. Her path in life was not as set as Jane's was. The possibilities had been endless. Rosier sniffed and composed himself. "Ilia," he said her name, but little more felt needed. "You told me once you were in love with Baelor Hightower, that you were set on him. But then that fateful fart happened, and you could no longer look at him without laughing. If it wasn't for that fart, you would be in Old Town now, happy and loved." He didn't know whether to find that funny or tragic. Tragic, now that he knew Oberyn had died for her too. The Mountain had done for them all except Aemyrus, killed by his own Kingsguard. Jaime Lannister, he would never have guessed, and he wasn't about to condemn him for it. "We did our duty, and we all died for it," he said, kneeling in the snow. "Now I'm here, with a man who says he's my son, but he calls another man father, and I know I'll never have all of him. But I am his father, and I know he'll never have all of me, because the most important part of me is still with you, Rainziax, Aegon, and Lyanna. No fire gods can bring that back to me." The tree remained silent and impassive, and he realized the futility of what he was doing. Heaving a sigh, he sat back in the snow and shivered against the fresh falls blowing down around. He wanted to break down and scream for the pain gnawing at his soul now, but he could not even hear beyond the wall where no one would ever know. All the same, the tears came, hot, but quickly freezing in the frigid air. He had a son he never knew he had. But that flicker of life in Lyanna's belly was a man grown and a stranger to him. But then that stranger's hand landing gently on his shoulder, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I saw you leave the tunnel," said Jon. "I couldn't let you wander off on your own. It's not safe out here." The son scolded the father, and Rhaegar almost laughed. He broke down, choking on his own tears, and almost laughed at the same time. One by one, the ravens flew from Maester Clytus's window across the yard. A flurry of feathers and a blur of black beating wings, vanishing rapidly into the breaking day, to Bear Island and Deepwood Motte, to White Harbor and the Last Hearth. Everywhere in the north except Winterfell itself. Sansa had even dispatched Brienne of Tarth and her hapless squire to Riverrun, in hopes that her great-uncle would fight for her as he fought for Robb. But Riverrun would soon be under siege from Frakes and Lannisters, if Rhaegar had the right of it. Jon had to throw in a sweetener to help matters along. Help take back the north for the Starks, and the north would help take back the Riverlands for the Tullys, driving the Lannisters back to the Rock in the process. Even as he wrote the terms for the Blackfish, Jon remembered the childhood fantasies he had had of being the one to save Winterfell from some mortal peril of his own imagining. Now his adult self smiled wryly at the thought that he may be about to liberate not just Winterfell, but the childhood home of Catelyn Stark as well. Some dark part of his being wished she was still alive just so they could savor the irony together. When the last bird vanished on the horizon, Jon turned from the window and continued dressing himself. His watch had ended, so he no longer wore the customary black garb of the watch and, instead, donned a gray lamb's wool tunic over black breeches and a brown boiled leather jerkin, the sort of thing he would have worn had he still been at Winterfell. Before leaving his chambers, he unhooked Longclaw and held it to the soft morning light now streaming through the windows. The scabbard had almost entirely disintegrated overnight, and the blade had been nowhere near his fire. Gingerly, he brushed the flat side blade with the tip of his finger and found it hot. While he was pondering that conundrum, the sounds of Rogar stirring in the room connected to his own drew his attention. They met in the hallway beyond, and Jon could tell he had not slept at all. The deposed prince grunted a terse greeting as they fell into step, and Jon showed him the sword, a feeble attempt to give Rogar something to think about other than his dead family. "What say you of this?" he asked, handing the blade over hilt first. "It's so hot it burned its own scabbard to ash." Rudyr held it until they were outside, whereupon he let the Valyrian steel reflect the morning sun. Just as it always had, it drank the sunlight, and the many folds and tempering rippled down its length. The heat had done nothing to tarnish its beauty. "I noticed this when we were at Harrenhal together," the prince observed. "Beautiful blade. Valyrian steel, unless I'm very much mistaken. It's not ice, though. Where did you get it?" Jon explained about saving his predecessor from a wight and being gifted Longclaw as a mark of gratitude. All the while, the other man continued studying it, running his palm against the flat as Jon had recently done. "I don't know," the prince answered, returning to the point at hand. "Too close to the fire, perhaps. There is another explanation, but I don't want to go jumping to conclusions just yet." Jon frowned. "What sort of conclusions?" Rosier looked like a man who knew a lot more than he was letting on, and his shrug was a half-hearted gesture. Without saying further, he handed the sword back and asked, "Is there a library I can avail of?" There wasn't much of a library to speak of, but a place where books and scrolls were kept, some of which were as old as the hills. Jon remembered, with small dismay, that Sam had raided the archive before leaving for Old Town. But not even Sam could have carried off every book in there, he reassured himself. As such, he directed Rodier accordingly. He was about to go there immediately before Jon stopped him. "At least join us to break your fast," he said, not keen for him to go wandering off on his own. It would do him no good to be shut away on his own for long hours. To his relief, Rhaegar agreed, and rejoined him as they made their way to the common hall. Inside, they found Sansa being regaled with courtship advice, courtesy of Tormund Giantsbane, with Ed and a few of the others looking on apologetically. Jon inserted himself between them before Tormund could launch into his skewered pig impression and ladled himself a bowl of porridge and honey. "Just when we were getting to the most interesting part," Ed observed, drawled as ever. Sansa managed a polite but awkward laugh before greeting her cousin with a kiss on the cheek. "What news?" he asked the high table at large. Although still seated at the high table, it was Ed who occupied the Lord Commander's place now. No formal choosing had yet taken place, but Jon suspected Ed would be returned with a strong majority, much to Mallister of Eastwatch's dismay. Jon noticed Sansa glancing sidelong at Rhaegar, as if sudden afraid of him. Coloring slightly, she said, "We, have a new queen." "Really?" Rosier replied, oblivious to Sansa's discomfiture. "The crown seems to change hands so freely these days. Do you swap it among yourselves on rotation?" Upon noticing the sharp look Jon was giving him, he quickly simmered down and added, "Forgive me, Lady Stark. That was unnecessary, and none of this is your fault. Tell us, who is the new queen?" Sansa quickly recovered herself. "Cersei Lannister." Jon and Rhaegar both choked on their oaths. "What?" they chorused. "Master Cladius told me all about it," she explained, just as Davos and Melisandre joined their company. Saxley was arrested by the Faith Militant and made to walk naked through the streets of King's Landing, but they put her and Queen Marguerite on trial anyway, so she got out of it by blowing up the Septet of Baelor with all the Faith Militant and all of House Tyrell crammed inside it. Her son, King Tommen, then jumped from a window in Maegor's Holdfast and into the dry moat. He impaled himself on the spikes below, whereas Princess Marcella was dead already, poisoned by the Martells. So Cersei herself now rules as queen in her own right. Rosier had only been given the briefest of outlines of all that had happened since the fall of his house, so Jon watched his reaction carefully. Clearly baffled and shocked in equal measure, his breakfast was soon forgotten as he began firing off questions. What in seven hells was a Lannister doing in Dorne? Surely Dorne wasn't so quick to forgive the murder of his sister and the children, he asked, frowning into the middle distance. That, he answered himself. Obviously not, if the princess was poisoned, and what are the damn Faith Militant doing back in the city? They were defeated and driven away centuries ago, and I cannot believe Cersei Lannister is so pious as to willingly arm a private militia of religious fanatics. Well, not unless she's changed enormously since I knew her, and why not? Everyone and everything else has. And there is another problem, said Sansa. Jon drew a deep breath and braced himself for whatever was next. Cersei still believes I murdered her son, she continued. She wants my head on a spike outside the Red Keep, and she'll stop at nothing to get it. Tyrion's too. Cersei can go and whistle for your head, my lady, Rogier retorted. Jon also was unduly concerned. No Lannister army could march this far north, and surely even Cersei isn't fool enough to attempt it. You will be safe, I promise you. He kept forgetting that she, of all people, stood accused of murder. What of the Tyrells? Asked Ragger. You say all of them were killed at the Great Sept. That's what Clydas told me, Sansa confirmed. We could still win support among their bannermen, especially now. Jon knew what she meant. The Targaryens made the Tyrells, granting them Highgarden despite the superior claim of House Florent. Ever since, they had remained steadfast supporters of the dragons until Mace Tyrell bent the knee to King Robert. There was only one problem. The Tyrell army will be even farther away than the Lannister army. It's no good to us. Sansa looked surprised. I mean, for when you take the south again. Surely you mean to, now that I'm magically back from the dead. Ragger finished the sentence for her. The war is in the north, and we must focus all our resources and abilities on that first. As for what comes next, I cannot say. What I can say is that I have little and less interest in that wretched iron chair and the duplicitous snakes that live their lives coiled around its stupid blades. Clearly, Rhaegar had had enough of the conversation and rose abruptly. He took his leave and strode from the common hall, probably in search of the library. Jon watched him go, quietly annoyed at his lashing out at Sansa for the second time in as many hours. He's right, said Melisandre. You must focus on the war to come. No one else is. Over the next days and nights, the truth of Melisandre's words became increasingly clear to him. No one else was coming. Brienne would still be sailing to the Riverlands, but the ravens from the northern houses should have started returning by then. Should have, but they hadn't. The North responded to their rallying cry with the deafening sound of silence. Every day, Jon checked with Clydas and watched the skies for approaching ravens. On the third day, Mormont answered. 62 men, they pledged, and Lady Lyanna Mormont was already en route for Castle Black to join them. It was better than nothing, but it was nowhere near enough. Soon after that, Glover replied with a lengthy screed about how Robb had wronged them and left them to languish under Ironborn misrule. On the fifth day, the Hornwoods pledged 500 mounted men. Lady Hornwood had been locked in a dungeon and starved to death after being forced to marry Ramsay Bolton, so the Dread Fort could annex her lands. Jon had heard all about it from Maester Luwin. Jon appreciated the show of defiance, but it still wasn't enough. A few thousand free folk, 62 Mormonts, and 500 Hornwoods. That was it. Everything, it seemed, rested on a dragon hidden in the crypts of Winterfell that had grown up in darkness. It affected them, made them smaller and weaker than they should be. Besides that, he didn't even know how they were going to set it free to do its damage in the first place. To stop himself falling into despair, he sought out Rhaegar, who was still searching through the old texts of the library. He'd heard it said before that the prince was bookish to a fault, but never realized how true it was. As soon as Jon entered, he looked up from the text he was studying and pushed the books away. "Follow me outside and bring Longclaw with you," he said, pushing right past him. Minutes later, they were standing in the snowy courtyard with Jon holding the blade aloft. It smoked in the air around them, the heat seeping from within the blade itself. As unusual as the phenomena was, Jon saw no changes. "Touch the edge of the blade," Rogier instructed. "Just enough to break the skin and bleed." Although reticent, Jon did so. Valyrian steel never lost its edge, so it didn't take much effort. The metal punctured his skin where he pressed his forefinger into the tip. Bright, fresh blood soon blossomed there. Almost immediately the metal ignited. Jon cursed in shock, almost dropping the sword. But Rhaegar caught it and smiled. "There," he said, holding Longclaw steady with him. Together they watched the blade ignite as his blood sacrifice ran the length of the blade. Aowen struck. Rhaegar whispered the name, Lightbringer. With Brienne gone, it was Sir Davos Seaworth and Lady Melisandre who accompanied Sansa to Mola's town. Even with Uncle Brandon's sword on her hip again, she still had no idea of how to use it, so she appreciated the protection. What they found there was a semi-derelict shell of a once bustling little place, but wildling raids had left the homes gutted and the notorious brothel in ruins. Whoever had survived the raids had long since fled and sought sanctuary farther south. Sansa thought she would sooner take her chances with the free folk than rely on any Bolton for sanctuary. Unsurprisingly, she found the man she sought in the gutted ruins of the brothel, but she knew that where she saw only ruins, Petyr Baelish saw a business opportunity, especially now that his establishment in the capital had been ransacked and shut down by the Faith Militant. Another tidbit of information that had come in Clytus's ravens from the south. To Petyr's credit, the relief on his face when he saw her looked real enough, but when he went to embrace her, she flinched and backed off. Quick as a snake, Davos's hand gripped the hilt of his sword, ready to strike. Only Sansa herself called him off, one hand raised to pacify him. "It's all right, sir," she assured him. "We are quite safe." Nevertheless, she did not want to be alone with Petyr. Not only for safety's sake, but also because she enjoyed the sight of him squirming in front of a man at arms and the highly disconcerting Red Priestess. Melisandre had a way of looking at people as though she could see what was in their minds, as though their hearts were open books open for her own perusal. And Petyr Baelish was a man with a lot of hidden secrets buried in his own breast. If only I could cut them out, she thought as she touched Uncle Brandon's sword. "My lady," he finally spoke, gaze darting between the three of them. "I cannot tell you how relieved I am to find you safe and unharmed." "Unharmed?" she repeated, thinking back over all the things Ramsay did to her. Before she could stop it, the horrors that happened in Winterfell were tumbling out of her. Petyr kept cringing, as though attempting to make himself as small as possible, while Sir Davos fully drew his sword, and she made no move to stop him this time. "Just say the word, my lady, and I'll strike this creature down where he stands." Davos snapped once she fell silent. "My lady, please, for the love I bore your mother and—" "Don't you ever mention her name again," Sansa cut in, anger flaring hot in her chest. Uncle Brandon's sword felt so snug in her gloved hand. All the while, she couldn't tear her eyes from the soft flesh of Pety's throat. She knew she could do it. Whip out the sword in a fast slash to the exposed apple. How hard could it be? No one needs training to be able to stick a sword in someone's neck. Even she could do it. It would only take a second, and it would be over in less. But then sweet Robin would turn the Knights of the Vale around and march them home again. The North would be lost to the Starks forever. Not for the first time in her life, Sansa had to swallow her own desires and her real feelings. She choked them down and almost gagged. All the while, her face was a mask of docile passivity. She had so much practice in King's Landing, it was almost second nature. It wasn't your fault, Petyr," she stammered tearfully. "How could you have known what a monster Ramsay is? I didn't mean to shout at you, but this is hard for me." Petyr's relief was palpable. He sagged as the tension left his body, and he stumbled forwards to embrace her tenderly. "I will do anything, and I mean anything, to make up for what happened to you, my sweeling. I told you in my letter, the Knights of the Vale are at your disposal." Now that she had that confirmed, she pulled away from Petyr sharply. "Good," she answered, suddenly very brisk and businesslike. "Jon and I, with a host of 2,000 wildlings and a little over 500 others, will be marching south to Winterfell on the morrow. The march will take months, so I trust to our host will meet yours on the road." Petyr smiled, the old smile. The one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course, my lady. At least I have more to offer than a host of savages." "Thank you, Lord Petyr. I knew I could trust you," she lied, ignoring the barbs. "We had best be going back now, so I'll see you later." Already, Petyr looked stung, as though he hoped she would stick around for a candlelit supper. "We leave for Winterfell on the morrow," she reminded him. "And it's a long ride back to Castle Black." With that, she turned to walk towards the shattered door of the brothel. Davos lingered behind with the sword still drawn, not taking any chances, but Melisandre had already left and mounted her mule. "My lady," Petyr called after her, before she could leave. Sansa suppressed a sigh and looked back at him. "Yes?" Petyr took a cautious step toward her, his hands folded in front of him. "My lady, I have been hearing some very curious stories about Jon Snow." "That's nice," she cut in, abruptly. "Once the battle is done and you have made amends for selling me to my enemies, perhaps I'll let you tell me all the stories you've heard about my brother." In a rare show of humility, Petyr blushed a deep red. A sign that even he knew he was taking too many liberties much too soon. It was late by the time they made it back to Castle Black. Jon was locked away with his commanders, and Ser Davos immediately went to join them. Only Melisandre remained with her, as she returned to her chambers. Sansa was curious when the priestess followed her inside. "I have something for you, Lady Stark," she said. "You must tell no one, not even Jon Snow." Melisandre pressed something into Sansa's hands, a choker with a large ruby set in the middle. For a moment, Sansa thought it was the exact same one, but when she looked, she could still hairs glowing at her throat. Holding it up to the light, she could see that the stone was dark and not glowing like the one the other woman wore, but it was warm to the touch. "I should wear it the same as you wear yours?" she asked. "Yes, when no one is watching," Melisandre advised. "Remember, tell no one." The ruby fell from Rhaegar's breastplate, and that small fact seemed to be important. Suddenly nervous, she thanked the priestess and slipped it into her pocket. The last time someone had given her a piece of jewelry, it turned out to contain poisoned amethysts, and she had had no idea until Joff lay choking, his face turning black as the strangler worked its magic. But when she tried the choker on, much later that night, as she slipped into her nightgown, nothing bad happened. At first, she didn't think anything had happened at all. She put it on and fixed the clasp at the back of her neck, fumbling blindly as she did so. It felt much too tight, like it literally was choking her. Then it settled, as though it had stretched to just the right size for Sansa's throat. Then, nothing. She sat on the edge of her bed and waited. What for, she did not know, but after a while she noticed the liver spots on the back of her hands. Alarmed, she got up and felt her joints aching. Then she noticed that her coppery auburn hair had turned pure white and brittle. With her heart pounding, she stood before the mirror and beheld her ancient face. Sansa Stark was nowhere in sight. She had been replaced by the crone above. Rogier almost collided with Sansa as he was exiting the stables, and her entering. They dodged each other, laughing breathlessly until she caught him by the arm. "Your Grace," she said, dipping an elegant curtsy. "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" Strangely abashed by the formalities, Rogier felt heat color rising in his face. "My lady, I am no longer your Grace. An ex-prince has no titles. Just call me Rhaegar." Then he thought about it a little more. "Actually, I'm your uncle by marriage." But the girl didn't seem to be listening anymore. "Do you remember the rubies on your breastplate?" she asked. "Can you remember why you chose them specifically?" Whatever he had expected, it wasn't that. Frowning, he framed them in his memory. "I picked them because red is the color of my house, and they're shiny and pretty." "So, you did no magic on them," she pressed on. Roger laughed, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Heavens no, child. They're just ornamental rubies is all." "Why would you ask that?" "Oh, no reason," she replied, a little overbrightly. "Fare you well, uncle." Something was clearly troubling her, he thought, but he was in position to pry. "You too, my lady." With that passing strange encounter concluded, Rhaegar finished saddling the courser he had been gifted and mounted up. Already they were prepared to ride south and take back Winterfell, but they had to move while the weather was still good, before they got snowed in and went the same way as poor King Stannis Baratheon. Just in case it wasn't bad enough that King Robert usurped the crown, he then had to sow such dissension among his own brothers that his own succession would be hotly disputed. Still, at least Stannis had saved the Watch when it had been at its most vulnerable. "Any word from Riverrun?" he asked Jon as they walked their mounts to the head of the procession. "Nothing," replied Jon, dejectedly. "Given the terms, I suppose I ought to be relieved. They had the Knights of the Vale, so even if the dragon fell through, they still stood a chance. The dragon was his role. You know, Jon, riding dragons isn't as simple as me walking up to him and jumping in the saddle, so to speak," he pointed out. "I don't automatically know how it's done just because I'm a Targaryen. Otherwise, you could do it yourself." "I need to lead the ground troops," he replied, defensively. "I'd be no good on a dragon." Rogier still couldn't believe that the dragon was down there. He would need to see it with his own 2 eyes. The egg had been blue and silver, he recalled. No doubt it would make a fine sight, roasting a few Boltons to death. "Have you told your own men that the dragon is down there?" he asked. "I will do," Jon answered, "but not until the last minute. There's too much risk of Ramsay finding out. And Rosie if he's still alive." They had received a letter from Ramsay, who styled himself Warden of the North. Beside that, he threatened to flay all the men marching on Winterfell and to rape Lady Sansa, while Jon himself was forced to watch. In case that hadn't been enough, Bolton claimed to have Rickon Stark as captive. He had only ever known Rose Bolton, but it sounded like the son was cut from much the same cloth. Before he could ask about Rickon, the horn sounded, a signal for them to form up and leave Castle Black. For the time being, at least, but Rosier knew if they could secure Rickon themselves, he would be the new Warden of the North and Lord of Winterfell. The largest region of Westeros in the hands of a child under 10 and surrounded by enemies. Whichever way this battle went, Rosier couldn't help but think Rickon's future seemed bleak. Soon, they passed through the gates of Castle Black 3 abreast. Jon was in the middle, with Sansa to his left, and Rhaegar to his right. They each shared a glance and nodded to each other. For better or worse, it was time to take back Winterfell. The hardest part of any battle was waiting for the slaughter to begin. Only this time, Jon felt like he had been waiting for that moment since he rode out the gates of Castle Black. Weeks turned into months as they made their slow and arduous journey south, avoiding the main road and sending scouts and outriders on ahead to watch for Bolton men. All the while, Jon stuck with the main body of the host, his nerves ratcheting up with every mile they trod, footsore and weary. What numbers they had were ready to drop and not get up again by the end of every arduous day. Food was scarce, and with winter closing in, there wasn't much by way of foraging either. Every evening, they set up camp in some sheltered spot, and Jon would climb to the top of whatever ridge or hillock they chose for cover, and look out over his army. It was a ragtag band of free folk, the remains of a few minor houses not entirely wiped out by the Boltons. That was it. 1,000 infantry, mostly free folk with little to no formal training, 600 cavalry, himself included. They were up against Bolton's 2,000 cavalry and 1,000 infantry. The North remembers, he thought to himself, sourly. As they entered the final leg of the journey, his thoughts began to stray from the battle itself to the reasons behind it. After setting up camp barely 5 miles from Winterfell, sheltered down a steep verge, he found himself wandering off again. Away from the tents and the men sheltering beneath hedges, up to the top of the verge. It was a clear night, bitterly cold. Wisps of cloud veiled the crescent moon. But he could see the stars and pick out a few of the constellations, the ones old Maester Luwin had taught him so long ago. He made it to the top and sat on a felled tree beside the road. 5 miles down that road, Winterfell stood in all its granite glory. He had not seen it since leaving to join the Night's Watch. Robb had come to see him off, and Jon remembered. With an acute clarity, the sight of the snowflakes melting in his brother's auburn hair. It seemed an age ago, a lifetime ago, yet still Robb's face, his presence and essence, was such an integral part of that castle's being. Jon still half expected to see him there upon his return, with the snowflakes still melting in his auburn hair. Robb is dead, he reminded himself. Rosier's Bolton put a sword through his heart. Just like Lord Stark, Lady Stark, Arya, for all he knew, and probably Rickon too. Luwin was dead, along with Old Nan and Roderick Castle. All the people who had made his home were dead, and he saw no sign of Rosier, offering them any miraculous second chances. Not even his mother, that sweet and willful girl he remembered dancing at the tourney. It would have been easy to list the dead and cut his losses, abandoning Winterfell as nothing more than a ghost of his half-buried past. But they were not the reason to give up. They were very reason he knew he had to fight this war, and keep on fighting after that. Then there was Sansa. While he looked out over the road to Winterfell, her hand touched his shoulder. Jolted out of his memories and thoughts, he came to all at once. "Forgive me, I did not mean to startle you," she said, sitting down beside him. "Are you worried about tomorrow?" Jon shrugged. "Of course. Have you heard from Baelish?" Ravens were much too dangerous to send just now, so Jon already knew the answer. But he found himself asking anyway. "No," she admitted. "But I think your father and Sir Davos are right. Ramsay's so full of himself that he thinks he can never be tricked." Jon knew the logic behind the plan. Let Ramsay believe his vastly superior host is only up against a tiny ragtag army, thinking to crush them like insects, only to bring in the Knights of the Vale at the very last minute as an unpleasant surprise for the new Warden of the North. Otherwise, if Ramsay knows the true size of Jon's forces, he will hide inside Winterfell and wait for winter to come and finish them off during a siege. Jon now had men, but he had no siege equipment at all. Likewise, he had no assurances from either Baelish or the Vale that they really were planning to intervene, and he didn't like it. Not one bit. Sansa, you've been on at me for weeks about what an untrustworthy snake in the grass this Petyr Baelish is, he reminded her. Now you're telling me to place all my trust and the lives of my men in his hands? How can you be certain he is true to his word? He is, I promise you, she assured him. When she offered nothing more than that, Jon turned to face her to see if she was going as mad as he thought. What makes you say that? Because he thinks he's getting Winterfell for himself, she smiled. Rather, he thinks to rule the North through me. And that's good enough for him. He thinks I'm like Robert Arryn, pliable, easily fooled. Once I heard Olenna Tyrell tell Petyr Baelish I was nothing more than a frightened little girl. That's what they all think of me. Jon listened, still uneasy about where all this was going. Are you a frightened little girl? Sansa shrugged. I was. On the morrow, I think I'll find out what I am now. Jon raised a half smile. I think I already know. She met his gaze and smiled back at him. Her skin was pale as milk glass under the light of stars and moon. Like a ghost. She was lacing a choker through her fingers, the pad of her index finger rubbing a large glowing ruby. He had no noticed it before, and the more she rubbed it, the more it glowed. Soon, it was casting a soft red light against her hands. Is that Melisandre's? He asked, curious. She shook her head. She made it for me. Feel it. Jon closed his hand around the stone, feeling the heat coming off it. Then he remembered the time he was in the cage with Melisandre, being winched up to the top of the wall for an audience with King Stannis. He asked her how come she never seemed cold, and she replied by telling him to touch her face. She was as warm as this ruby, the same type she wore at her throat. How come you're not wearing it? He asked, handing it back. It would suit you. Oh, I can't, she replied, quickly. It's too tight around my throat. Well then, once this battle is fought, we'll see if we can't get a jeweler to widen it for you, he replied, thinking she would like that. A fitting jewel for the Lady of Winterfell. Let's not tempt fate, she replied abruptly, slipping the gem into the pocket of her cloak. The hour is late, cousin. I must rise early on the morrow to meet with Petyr Baelish. Inwardly, Jon cringed. I don't like you being near him. Melisandre will be with me, she assured him, and Ramsay and his men will be parleying with you. She and I will slip through the lines unnoticed. Jon still did not like it. Are you really going to Baelish, if he's even there, or are you going to do something stupid? Ever since they left Castle Black, he had seen Sansa and the Red Priestess with their heads together more times than he could count. Plans they kept from him, which set his nerves to twinging. He found himself wondering if, perhaps, she was still angry with him for forbidding her to sneak into the crypts to unleash Somyar. He would do it himself once they breached the walls and needed to flush out the rest of Bolton's men, forcing them into a rout. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best they could hope for. Of course not, she said stiffly. All will be well. Good night to you then, he said, kissing her cheek. Her skin was hot. You too. He watched her leaving, until she was swallowed by the darkness, and then the camp sprawled out below. Drawing a deep, steadying breath, he realized he would not see her again until after the battle was done, for good or ill. As she slipped away, Rekar slipped into view. As with the sun, he liked to escape the camp and hold his own council of one. It seemed to Jon, sometimes he found himself wondering whether he had done the right thing at all, by bringing him back only to fight more wars. To Sames's disappointment, the Boltons were still not blind. They knew the Starks were coming and had prepared accordingly. As she stole through the morning mists, she came upon the field that would soon become the killing ground of Winterfell, and spied the archers' range markers already dotting the rough terrain. They were just large wooden crosses, but she could see men bearing stretchers over to them with what looked suspiciously like flayed man to be nailed to them. Doing her best to ignore them, she circled the battlefield and gave them all as wide a berth as possible. The small folk were gone. To her relief, none of them had sought sanctuary inside Winterfell's walls. Instead, they must have gone to Wintertown, close by. It would not do to roast one's own small folk, whether by accident or not. The noise coming from within the castle chilled her to the bones. Men were drilling, preparing for the fight ahead. She could hear barked commands from the generals, men's voices raised above the din of Ramsay's hounds barking relentlessly at all the tumult. The nearer she got, the louder and sharper the noises became. From within the pocket of her cloak, she pulled the choker and fixed it to her throat. The sensation of being strangled momentarily stole the breath from her, but she soon adjusted, and it found its fit in a half a heartbeat. All she had to do then was arrange her shawls to hide the gem, a task complicated by the throbbing glow that timed with the beat of her heart. Glamoring, Melisandre called it. But rather than making her glamorous, it turned her into a stooped old crone with liver spots and varicose veins. However, despite that and the aching joints of age, she could still move with a young woman's stamina and spoke with a young woman's voice. She had to play act the stoop and make sure she shuffled and stumbled, clutching at her tattered old shawls as though every breath of wind was cutting right through her. Getting close enough to Winterfell to see it properly took hours. By the time she made it, the sun was fully up behind a bank of dark gray clouds, and the enemy soldiers were already forming up. She kept an eye out for Ramsay, but she could not see him anywhere. To her relief, the fighting men coming and going from the castle looked right through her. As if she wasn't there at all, one man walked right into her, knocking her over. His companion, a longbow man, hoisted her back up again, apologizing hastily. When he saw into her face, he peered at her so intently that, for one heart-stopping second, she thought her choker had failed, and was recognizing her. "There's a battle coming, old lady," he said, after a long pause. "This is no place for the old and infirm. I'd head back the way you came if I were you. And fast as you can, too. It's starting any minute now." Despite the glamour, Sansa trembled in his grip. A frightened little girl, Olenna Tyrell's voice reminded her. True to the sentiments, her mouth ran dry with fear and her voice shook helplessly as she tried to form the words. "I have information for Lord Bolton about Lady Bolton." The two men, clearly troubled now, exchanged a dark look. She could tell they were torn over what to do. Ramsay would be too busy now, but they dare not risk letting her slip away either. "What sort of information?" the longbow man who'd knocked her over asked. "I knew her father, so she trusts me," Sansa explained. "I gave her sanctuary and I would lead Lord Bolton to her myself. I am old and poor, and winter is upon us. I need the gold from her bounty if I am to survive. Bring me inside to wait out the battle, and I will see you get your share." Still the men were hesitant. "If you're lying, I'll peel your wrinkled hide off your scrawny frame myself." The threat made her stomach roil, but she just about held her composure as the two men-at-arms led her through the gates. Once through the thick walls, the noise became almost overwhelming. Marching men, their boots crunching through ice and loose gravel, the hounds barking up a frenzy, and commands being shouted from the battlements. They were taking her straight to Ramsay, she knew, so she ducked into a throng of marching men who were headed for the outer gates, as quick as she dared. She breathed a sigh of relief as she noted she wasn't the only non-combatant in the yard. Others were skulking around, drawing water from the well and carrying out last-minute checks. They were all cowed and silent, fear and tension written in their weather-beaten faces. Sansa tried to stick with them as the vast army of Boltons, Umbers, and Karstarks made their way outside in formation. Passing what was once the glass gardens, she kept hugging the walls until she reached the crypts close to the entrance for the Godswood, the same Godswood where she had married Ramsay. The memory of their wedding night reared up in her mind's eye. Once more, images and sensations flashing through her head. She could feel Ramsay's hands on her body, his nails raking her flesh, the tearing of her maiden head and the screams torn from her raw throat. All of that and more as his face swam before her, vivid and alive, and real. It was really him. She could see him standing at the top of the stone steps leading to the great hall, his hounds barking madly all around him. Smaljin Umber was with him, alongside Lord Karstark. For a moment, their gaze met, but all he saw was an old woman, a crone drafted in to help with the cleanup operation after the battle. No doubt, she should have been afraid. She should have been trembling and pissing herself with fear. But she had no more fear left in her. When her father died, she had wept until she had no more tears left. Now it was the same, and she was fresh out of fear. "Winter is coming," she thought to herself, in more ways than one. After months of waiting, the moment for the carnage to begin had arrived. The battle lines had formed up, and the two sides eyed each other from a wide divide. It was the smell of burning flesh, however, that stuck out for Rhaegar. He could see the flayed bodies burning on the X-shaped range markers, a uniquely Bolton touch to proceedings. Or so he thought, wryly to himself. To his right, Jon was as taut as a bowstring. Rhaegar turned to him, wondering if now was the right time to tell him Sansa had defied his orders and snuck into Winterfell disguised as an old crone. Probably not, he reasoned. The feint has worked, Jon, he said instead. That's the entire Bolton army arrayed before us. On Jon's other side, Ser Davos seethed. Now let us bloody well hope the Knights of the Vale get here on time. They better, or I'll hunt Petter Baelish through all 7 of his hells myself, Jon brusquely interjected. His destrier stamped its feet, restive and keen to get moving. After a moment spent glaring at his opponent, Jon turned to Ser Davos. You need to know, sir. There's a dragon under the castle. I'm going to set it free. What? Davos choked. It was our secret weapon, and it had to stay secret, Roxer added. Worry not. That's why I'm here. I'll keep it under control, and make sure it targets only the enemy. To be sure, he had taught Sansa the High Valyrian commands to get it to fly and breathe fire herself. If Jon doesn't set it free, someone else will, Rosier added. An actual dragon? Davos looked dumbstruck, with eyes as wide as saucers. You mean to tell me? The rest of his sentence was cut off by the sound of a war horn blasting in the distance, closely followed by a volley of arrows fired from the Bolton lines. In response, Rosier's heartbeat raced as the battle opened. They were well out of range, but he knew there would be swarms of squires already dispatched to fetch the fallen arrows back. Hold fire. Jon bellowed down the lines. Let them do all the hard work for now. Besides, they had no arrows to waste. Half a heartbeat later, the cavalry charge began. The eerily still air was suddenly torn apart by the thundering of horses' hooves as thousands of mounted men at arms charged across the field. Before he knew what he was doing, his own spurs had dug into his horse's flanks, and he was charging forwards faster and faster. As the charge continued, the spearmen lowered their weapons, ready to skewer the enemy on the front lines. Their coming heralded in volleys of arrows sailing across the heavily leaden skies. But all Rogar could see was Winterfell itself. Winterfell rising across the prow of the hill. Lyanna must have ridden these hills hundreds of times and more besides. The Bolton cavalry charge grew larger and larger, until Rhaegar could almost see the whites of the horses' rolling eyes and the foam lashing from their flanks. He drew his long sword moments before the two sides met in a sickening clash of steel and soft, yielding flesh. Sansa flinched as the impact of the cavalry charge made the ground beneath her feet shake. She paused halfway down the top floor of the crypt and strained to hear the distant sounds of battle, just to make sure the time had come. Satisfied that it had, she tore off the choker and hitched up her skirts to make a run for it, past her Uncle Brandon and Aunt Lyanna, past her father and grandfather and all those kings of winter whose names she could barely recall. She flung open the doors and leapt down the stone steps. Falling more than once, she could only pick herself up again and keep running, deeper and deeper into the cavernous crypts. Breathless and sweating, she reached the fallen masonry and vaulted it, shoving aside a stone boulder as she went. The blood coursing through her veins gave her more strength than she realized she had. Farther and farther into the crypts, it wasn't long before the sounds of battle being fought overhead were lost to her. All the same, she kept on running. She reached the part of the crypts where ancient iron doors had completely rusted away. The hinges nothing more than long burnt red streaks staining the granite walls. She paused again, catching her breath. Now that she knew she was getting closer, still, her heartbeat raced so fast she thought her heart might just jump clean out of her chest. After allowing herself the luxury of half a minute's rest, she continued. Her lungs were burning in her chest as she fought for air, her legs aching as she ran faster than she ever had before. Down the broad steps, and along an ancient gallery, the edge of the dragon's pit loomed up out of nowhere, and she had to grab the edge of the doorway to prevent herself plunging down the steep incline. "Seigneur!" she called out. "Seigneur!" As Sansa teetered on the edge of the steep include, gasping for breath, a low and rumbling growl filled the air around her. Relief washed over her then, as two molten blue eyes raised from the ground and met her own. Seigneur reared up, revealing his full size as he seemed to fill the chamber, and he spread his leathery wings. His neck swung downward so his head was level with her own. After a moment contemplating her, Seigneur opened his massive jaws and screamed the fiercest greeting Sansa had ever heard. She caught the blast of dragon breath in the face. It blew her hair back from her face, and she could see every sharp tooth he had, and two wide holes at the side where jets of fire would soon be raining down around them. Cautiously, she reached up and touched the dragon's face. "It is time," she said, hoping Bran was in there. "Let's go." Jon swiped Longclaw over the cloak of a dead man, wiping off the blood and dirt so that the steel shone again. Holding it up, he ran his own finger down the hot blade, feeding it the blood sacrifice it needed to spark into life. All in the space of a second, the blade set to fire and lit the way through the gloom of the battlefield. "Men," he cried out over the racket, "form up with me." He swung around as the second line of Bolton infantry charged into the fight, hacking and slashing each man down who dared enter his path. Some shied from the burning sword at the last minute, others barely even noticed it. Jon killed them all the same. He thrust at one man's belly, then wrenched the blade out to decapitate another in one smooth movement. Didn't seem to matter how many times he sunk the blade into another's flesh. The flames held and kept on dancing as the battle ground relentlessly on. All the while, the arrows from the archers rained down on them from afar. It was a storm of steel, shit, and blood. The second charge from the Bolton lines was met with Jon's, but he knew he had no more men left after this. This, he thought, is a bloody good time for the Knights of the Vale to show up. But there was no sign of them, and Winterfell remained as distant as ever. No matter how they cut through Bolton men, they couldn't gain any ground while the archers held fast. Now when they tried to retreat, their path was blocked by a bank of corpses and dying men desperately trying to fight for their lives. All he could do was press on, aiming for the castle gates, and cutting through the people, attempting to stop him as best he could. Up to his knees in blood, mud and the dead, he get going and going. Every so often, he caught sight of Ramsay Bolton. The human press would recede, suddenly falling away, and Jon would catch sight of him. Well away from the fighting, there was no chance of reaching him, and bringing this carnage to a quick end. "Craven," he grunted as he caught sight of the man again. "Jon, we're fucked." It was Rhaegar's voice, but instead of hanging around to elaborate, the deposed prince lunged into a thicket of enemies, blade drawn and dancing its dance. But before long, Jon saw what he meant. They were surrounded on all sides, completely hemmed in by a ring of steel. Angered and frustrated, Jon hacked down a nearby Bolton and thrust Longclaw, still burning, right through his chest and out the other side. He yanked the sword back out, ready to take down another when he felt the earth tremble beneath his feet. Almost unbalanced, he righted himself swiftly and carried on fighting his hopeless fight. The first earth tremor was rapidly followed by a second and third, but no one else seemed to notice it. Jon plunged on, hacking down the enemy and up to his elbows in blood and gore. He could even feel it in his hair and seeping through his clothes. If he was to die for real this day, he wanted to take his sister's rapist with him, and it was Ramsay he cut a path to. "Who owns the North?" a man's voice bellowed across the field. I said, "Who owns the North?" The replies of thousands of voices was cut off. The earth seemed to tremble and roar beneath their very feet. Still, the Bolton shield wall formed up around them, the pikes jutting between the shields and trained on Jon's own forces. "Songyar," Jon murmured beneath his breath. The dragon crashed through the crypts in a hail of falling masonry and dust, each downfall making him roar in fury. If the doorways weren't wide enough, he would run at them and smash them through with his terrifying strength. Saintia screamed, ducking her head beneath Sonyar's wing as the debris came crashing down around them. By the time they made it into the newer, more spacious parts of the crypt, Sonyar was running so fast, she could no longer keep up. Her strength was flagging, her legs about to give up from under her, and she was faint from lack of air. Simply unable to go on, Sansa sank to her knees as Sonyar smashed his way through the crypts. Only the sight of the dragon smashing down her Aunt Lyanna's tomb got Sansa back on her feet again. Summoning every ounce of her strength, she lunged after him and managed to grab Sonyar's leg just as he approached the stairwell leading up to the ground level. "I'm sorry," she called out as she secured her hold on the dragon. She wasn't meant to be doing this. She didn't know the first thing about riding dragons. But she grabbed a horned scale that protruded from his back and managed to swing herself upwards. All the while, she held on for dear life, sending up silent prayers that he would not simply throw her off. In the event, if Sonyar even noticed her clinging desperately to his scales, he gave no sign of it as he bowled through the door of the crypts. Sansa cried out as her world turned black and masonry fell all about her. The crashing and splintering had been deafening, but suddenly the light was dazzling bright all around her. Dazed, it took a second and longer for her to realize she was looking at the open sky. Sonyar crashed to a halt in the grounds of Winterfell. where he roared so loud it drowned out the shouts and curses of the men left behind to defend the castle walls. Clinging to Sonyar's back, she saw the men at arms reel in shock. But it wasn't long before one recovered his wits and knocked an arrow to his bow. She remembered the words Prince Rhaegar had taught her the night before. "Sovis," she shouted as firmly as she could. "Sonyar, Sovis." Sonyar spread his wings as a volley of arrows flew all around them, one narrowly missing Sansa as she ducked her head against the dragon's spines. Before she knew any better, they were soaring upwards as fast as a falcon. The little bird had finally taken wing, and all were fleeing before her in mortal terror. Only a foolish few remained to fire at Sonyar, the arrows falling short, but one glanced off his flanks, causing him to roar in anger. With no idea what to do next, less still of how to control or direct the dragon, she resorted to crying out the second word the prince had taught her. Dragon fire. Dracarys, Dracarys. A jet of fire billowed through the sky as Sonyar swooped down on the men attacking him with arrows. Some were still aflame as they plummeted down the battlements. Others merely burned alive where they stood with their longbows still in their charring hands. When the flames cleared, she could see the whole battlefield spread out far below her. Stark forces surrounded by their Bolton enemies. She looked to the horizon, where a tide of glittering steel pounded into the fray on the backs of destriers. The Vale, she rallied with a rush of euphoria. Sansa's breath caught in her throat before she gave the command again. Dracarys. Just for a moment, as the dragon soared over the battlefield with her clinging to his back, she felt like she could conquer the world. If only she could control the wretched thing. It was then, as Sonyar brought her downwards, that she saw Ramsay fleeing back towards the castle. Sonyar hit the ground in front of him, blocking his escape route. She heard him curse heavily and the scrape of his sword being drawn. Grinning from ear to ear, she peeked around Sonyar's neck. "Sweet husband," she called, still atop the dragon. "How fare you?" Ramsay's stupid, bulbous eyes seemed to swell at the sight of her. His mouth flapped dumbly and unable to form any real word. He still held his sword, but already Sansa was bored of this silly game. "Dracarys," she commanded. Within a heartbeat, Ramsay was engulfed in fire, a black and misshapen lump at the heart of an orange conflagration. She thought she even saw the sword melting in his seared hands. "I will make a merry widow," she thought as she fell from the dragon's back and into the mud at his feet. Synasiad, lying exhausted on the ground. She turned her face to look up at him. He had to rejoin the battle, so yes. Warmed by Ramsay's flames, she watched Sonyar take wing and soar high into the sky. She would never be a dragon rider, she knew, but she enjoyed the ride, all the same. Jon reeled back as the dragon, vast and fearsome, rose sharply into the sky. Just for a second, the sword stilled in his hands as he listened to the roar and saw the jet of flame searing down on the Boltons. Everyone, Starks and Bolton alike, flinched against the rain of fire and the earth-splitting shrieks the beast made as it swooped down on them, before climbing back into the sky. Quickly, he gathered his wits. "Rogier, do something," he bellowed at his father. "We need to get him under control. Do something now." The enemy lines were recoiling in shock, but already some were trying to fight back by turning their arrows on the swooping and wheeling dragon. One or two hit, but only succeeding in drawing the vast creature's attention to them, luring him sharply downwards to breathe fire at his attackers. Meanwhile, Rhaegar lunged through the press of people, shouting at the top of his voice in High Valyrian. The dragon didn't seem to hear him, but still Rhaegar continued, and Jon couldn't make out a word of it. Before too long, however, a surge of Bolton men swept over the hillside as Sonyar suddenly swooped downwards and hit the ground with an almighty crash. Already, the dragon had broken Bolton's lines. Men threw down their weapons and fled on foot, whereupon Jon ordered his own to give chase. Thousands were fleeing from just a few hundred, the fields around them turning black with men fleeing. Jon gave chase too, his sword now extinguished. Even before the escapees crested the hill, the Knights of the Vale swept around the bend in the road, cutting off their escape. Thousands of armored and mounted knights descended the hill, swarming into the heart of the fight, and smashing what was left of Bolton's forces. There on the hill, Jon sank to his knees and thanked the old gods, new gods, many-faced god and the fire god all at once. Exhausted, unable to move, he could only sink there and watch as Knights of the Vale swept over the hills and across the fields in a great steel tidal wave, sweeping them all to victory.